The Pressure Files. What really happened to the OceanGate submersible. Hey everyone! Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would really help the channel grow. If you're enjoying this documentary, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps us more than you possibly know, and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dive investigations. Also, if you're up for it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. A massive thank you to Vortex and Scarlet Widow for submitting this idea. This is exactly the kind of story we live for here at Sleep Theories, where documented truth is stranger than fiction. On June 18th, 2023, 5 people descended toward the wreck of the Titanic in a submersible called Titan. None of them would return alive. The world was told it was a tragic accident, a catastrophic implosion caused by structural failure. But what if the official story is incomplete? What if there's evidence that something else happened down there in the crushing darkness, something that powerful institutions have worked very hard to keep quiet? Tonight we're going to examine the data they never released, the messages that disappeared, and the acoustic anomalies that don't match the narrative you've been told. This is the story of the Pressure Files, and what really happened to the OceanGate submersible. Part 1. The File That Started Everything. June 26th, 2023. 2 days after the Titan submersible was officially declared lost with all hands, a maritime analyst named Elias North received an email that would change everything. Elias wasn't a household name, but in the tight-knit world of deep-sea exploration and maritime safety analysis, he was respected. He'd spent 15 years working with various ocean research institutions, analysing dive data, and consulting on submersible safety protocols. The email came from an anonymous address, a randomly generated string of letters and numbers that would later prove impossible to trace. There was no message in the body of the email, just a single attachment. The file was named exactly this: Titan_pressure_anomalies_0519-0618.xlsx. Elias almost deleted it. Anonymous files from unknown sources were usually spam or worse, but something about the specificity of that file name made him pause. The dates caught his attention immediately. May 19th through June 18th. That ending date was the day Titan went down. He opened the file. What he found inside was extraordinary. Dozens upon dozens of entries, technical readings that appeared to be genuine OceanGate internal logs. Pressure readings, acoustic measurements, hull stress, calculations, things that should never have left the company's secure servers. Each entry was time-stamped, geo-tagged with coordinates, and included detailed technical annotations. Elias spent the first hour simply verifying what he could. The formatting matched OceanGate's known data structure. The technical terminology was correct. The coordinate readings aligned with known Titan dive locations from previous expeditions. Everything about the file screamed authenticity. But it was one specific entry that made his hands shake as he scrolled through the spreadsheet. June 18th, 0854, Coordinated Universal Time. Exactly the morning of the implosion, just minutes before Titan went silent. The entry read, Extremely Rapid Compression. Dash source, unknown. Dash external origin. External origin. Not a hull failure. Not an internal structural collapse. Something from outside the submersible. Elias read the line again. Then again. Then he started going through every other entry in the file, and what he discovered was even more disturbing. The pressure anomalies didn't start on June 18th. They went back weeks. There were irregular readings on multiple previous dives, entries that suggested Titan had been experiencing unexplained external pressure events long before its final journey. This contradicted everything the public had been told. The narrative was simple, almost reassuring in its clarity. Titan was an experimental submersible that had pushed its materials beyond safe limits. The hull failed. The occupants died instantly. Tragic, but explainable. A cautionary tale about innovation outpacing safety. But if this file was real, that story was incomplete at best, and deliberately misleading at worst. Elias saved 3 copies of the file to different secure locations, then began the most important investigation of his career. He had no idea that within weeks he would become one of the most sought after and simultaneously invisible figures in the deep-sea exploration community. And he definitely didn't know that powerful forces were already aware of what he'd received. Part 2. The Real Timeline. Before we go further into what Elias discovered, we need to establish the facts, the undisputed events that everyone agrees happened. Because the conspiracy here isn't about inventing fiction, it's about the spaces between the official facts, the gaps where uncomfortable questions live. OceanGate Expeditions was founded in 2009 by Stockton Rush and others. The company's mission was to make deep-sea exploration more accessible, to create submersibles that could take tourists and researchers to depths that had previously been accessible only to military or government-funded operations. It was an ambitious, even noble goal. The Titan itself was an unusual submersible. Unlike traditional designs that used heavy titanium spheres, Titan's passenger hull was made from carbon fibre and titanium. This made it lighter, and theoretically capable of faster descents and ascents. But carbon fibre behaves differently under repeated pressure cycling than titanium. It doesn't fail gradually. When it fails catastrophically. Titan began making dives to the Titanic wreck site starting in 2021. The RMS Titanic rests at approximately 3,800 metres below the surface, about 2.5 miles down. At that depth, the pressure is roughly 375 times what we experience at sea level. Every square inch of surface area experiences thousands of pounds of force. The dive that ended in tragedy launched on June 18th, 2023. Aboard were 5 people: Stockton Rush, the CEO of OceanGate and the pilot; Hamish Harding, a British businessman and adventurer; Shahzada Dawood and his son Suleiman Dawood, a Pakistani businessman and his 19-year-old son; and Paul-Henri Nargiole, a French deep-sea explorer who had visited the Titanic wreck more than 30 times. Titan lost contact with its support ship, the Polar Prince, 1 hour and 45 minutes into its descent. The last communication was a routine status message, then nothing. What followed was a massive search and rescue operation. Ships and aircraft from multiple nations converged on the area. The world watched and hoped. For days there was the possibility, however slim, that Titan was intact somewhere on the ocean floor, its occupants alive but unable to communicate. On June 22nd, debris was found near the Titanic wreck site. The pattern of the debris made it clear what had happened. Catastrophic implosion. The pressure hull had failed, and the implosion would have been instantaneous. The occupants would not have suffered. They would have died faster than their nervous systems could even register pain. Then came the detail that made Elias's anonymous file so significant. On June 28th, the United States Navy confirmed something remarkable. Their underwater acoustic monitoring system had detected what they called anomalous acoustic signatures at the time Titan went silent. In other words, the Navy had heard the implosion happen in real time. They'd known for days that Titan was lost, but they hadn't said anything publicly, supposedly to avoid compromising classified monitoring capabilities. That acoustic signature would become crucial to Elias's investigation. Part 3. The logs don't lie. Elias spent the next week doing something unusual for someone who received an anonymous leak. He tried to disprove it. He looked for any evidence that the file was fabricated, that someone had created an elaborate hoax. He contacted former OceanGate contractors through carefully worded inquiries that didn't reveal what he had. He cross-referenced the technical data with publicly available information about Titan specifications. Everything checked out. More disturbing, some of the technical details in the file matched, things that had never been made public. Specific serial numbers for sensors, internal code designations for monitoring systems, the kind of information that only someone with direct access to OceanGate systems would know. The pressure anomalies painted a disturbing picture. The file showed that Titan had experienced unexplained external pressure events on at least 6 separate occasions over the 3 weeks leading up to the final dive. These weren't the normal, gradual pressure increases you'd expect during descent. These were sudden spikes, moments where the external pressure on the hull increased dramatically for a few seconds, then returned to expected levels. On June 3rd, during a dive that had been publicly reported as successful, the log showed a pressure spike at 2,000 meters depth. The annotation read, "External percussion event dash source unidentified dash no damage observed." On June 9th, another spike, this time at 3,000 meters. Hull stress monitors registered readings that should have caused alarms, but apparently didn't. On June 14th, 4 days before the final dive, the most significant pre-disaster event occurred. At 3,500 meters, Titan experienced what the log described as lateral compression. Not pressure from above, which would be normal, not pressure equally distributed, which the hull was designed for. Pressure from the side, as if something had struck or pressed against the hull. The annotation on that entry was chilling. Microfracture, detected in aft hull segment dash, dive aborted dash returned to surface for inspection. Dash fracture could not be visually confirmed. Dash dive cleared for continuation. They knew something was wrong. They detected damage, but they couldn't see it, so they continued operations. Elias began reaching out to people who might be able to help him understand what he was seeing. He contacted metallurgists, pressure system experts, and acoustic engineers. He framed his questions carefully, presenting the data as hypothetical scenarios. What could cause sudden external pressure spikes at depth? What could create lateral compression on a submersible hull? The answers he got were troubling. Multiple experts told him the same thing. In the open ocean, at those depths, there's nothing that should create those kinds of pressure anomalies. The pressure at depth is immense, but it's also constant and predictable. It doesn't spike. It doesn't come from unexpected angles, unless something else is down there. A large object moving past the submersible? Possibly, if it were large enough and moving fast enough. But what moves at that speed at nearly 4,000 meters depth? A sudden current? Unlikely to create the patterns he was seeing. An underwater landslide or methane bubble release? The geology of the Titanic wreck site didn't support that explanation. That left options that no one wanted to say out loud. An undisclosed military vessel, an unknown geological phenomenon, or something else entirely. Part 4. The messages they didn't release public reporting established that Titan communicated with its surface support ship through text messages. This wasn't unusual for submersibles. Voice communication at those depths is difficult and often unreliable. Text messages sent through acoustic modems are more dependable. What the public was told was that Titan's last message was routine. A status update. Everything normal. Then silence. But Elias's file contained something else. References to messages that never appeared in any official timeline. 6 messages that, according to the logs, were sent from Titan on June 18th. Between 0830 and 0852, Coordinated Universal Time. The final message was logged as sent at 0853, just 1 minute before the pressure anomaly that appears to have preceded the implosion. The file didn't contain the full text of these messages. Instead, it had brief descriptions, possibly notes made by whoever was monitoring the communication. Elias spent days trying to track down anyone who might have access to the actual message logs. What he pieced together was fragmentary, but deeply unsettling. 0832. Message references visual distortion outside viewport. Description includes the phrase shimmering distortions and request for confirmation of expected visual phenomena at depth. 0837. Message mentions acoustic anomalies, described as metallic impacts not originating from hull stress or normal operational sounds. 0841. Request for sonar scan of surrounding area. Specific mention of possible object below current position. 0845. Query about whether another submersible is operating in the area. 0850. Request for immediate surface contact with Expedition Coordinator Nargiolet's previous dive data from the same location. 0853. Partial message, not fully transmitted. Begins with phrase, is there another, then nothing. At 0854, the extreme pressure anomaly. By 0856, Titan had ceased all communication and, according to Navy acoustic data, had imploded. What's extraordinary about these messages isn't just their content, it's that they were never mentioned in any official investigation summary, any press briefing, or any public statement. If they existed, they were deleted or suppressed. If they didn't exist, then why were they referenced in logs that otherwise proved to be completely accurate? Elias tried to approach this logically. Maybe the messages were routine and just not deemed relevant. Maybe they were communication tests. Maybe there was a mundane explanation. But he kept coming back to that June 18th entry at 0845. Query about whether another submersible is operating in the area. Why would Titan ask that question? What did they see or detect that made them think there was another vessel nearby? Part 5. The sounds. Nobody explained. The search for Titan captured global attention for days. Ships and aircraft searched the surface. Remotely operated vehicles searched the depths, and the whole time, acoustic monitoring equipment listened for any sign of the missing submersible. On June 20th, 2 days after Titan went missing, a Canadian P-3 Poseidon aircraft dropped sonobuoys into the search area. These devices float on the surface and extend hydrophones deep into the water to listen for sounds. Multiple sonobuoys detected what search coordinators described as banging noises at 30-minute intervals. This gave hope. Banging noises meant someone alive, trying to signal their location. The search intensified around the areas where the sounds were detected, but later analysis complicated the story. The banging sounds, it turned out, could have been anything. Underwater sounds travel in strange ways, reflecting and refracting, sometimes appearing to come from locations far from their actual source. Marine life, shifting metal on the ocean floor, even the search ships themselves could have created the sounds. The official position eventually became that the sounds were probably not related to Titan at all. Just acoustic artifacts of a noisy ocean environment. Elias's investigation revealed a different story. Through contacts he'd developed in the acoustic analysis community, Elias obtained copies of the actual sonobuoy recordings. Not the official summaries, not the press briefing descriptions, but the raw audio files and their technical analysis. What he found was extraordinary. The sounds detected on June 20th were not random. They occurred in patterns, every 30 minutes as reported. But the pattern was too regular, too mechanical. Human banging, even desperate human banging, would have variations in timing, in intensity, in rhythm. These sounds had none of that. They were metronomic, precise. More significant spectral analysis of the sounds showed frequency components that didn't match impacts on titanium or carbon fibre. The sounds had characteristics more consistent with sonar pings, specifically active sonar reflecting off a hard surface. In other words, something was down there using sonar, and whatever it wasn't Titan. Elias consulted with a retired naval acoustic technician named Marcus Webb, a man who'd spent 25 years listening to submarine sounds for the United States Navy. Webb lived in a small coastal town in Maine, and he agreed to meet Elias only after extensive vetting and assurances of anonymity. Webb analysed the recordings Elias had obtained. His conclusion was unequivocal. "This is active sonar," Webb told him. "Low frequency, high power, the kind of signature you get from a large object probably moving. And here's the thing that should concern you. I've heard a lot of sonar in my career. Russian submarines, Chinese submarines, our own boats, research vessels, you name it. This doesn't match anything in my reference library. The pulse structure is wrong. The frequency modulation is wrong. It's like someone built a sonar system that works on principles just slightly different from everyone else's." Elias asked the obvious question. Could it be classified military technology? Something we don't know about? Webb shrugged. Could be. But we're talking about the Titanic wreck site. That location isn't strategically important. There's no reason for any military to be operating experimental sonar systems there, unless they were looking for something specific. Like what? That's the question you should be asking. What's down there worth looking for? Part 6. The Navy's incomplete story. The United States Navy's acoustic monitoring system is called IUSS, the Integrated Underwater Surveillance System. It's a network of hydrophones scattered across the ocean floor, originally designed during the Cold War to track Soviet submarines. The system is so sensitive it can detect ships and submarines thousands of miles away. When the Navy announced on June 28th that they'd detected acoustic signatures consistent with Titan's implosion, it seemed like closure. They'd heard it happen. They could pinpoint when it occurred. The mystery of timing was solved. But Elias noticed something in the Navy's statement that bothered him. They said they detected signatures, plural, not signature, and they described them as anomalous. Not standard, not typical, not matching known implosion patterns. Anomalous. Through careful networking and more than one questionable information exchange, Elias obtained a document that would crack open the entire investigation. It was marked NAVCA, the Naval Sea Systems Command, with a classification header that had been partially redacted. The document was titled Atlantic Command Acoustic Analysis Event 0623 Echo. June 23rd was when debris from Titan was officially found. Echo was presumably just a designation code. But the contents of the document were extraordinary. The Navy had indeed detected Titan's implosion, but their analysis showed something nobody had made public. There were two distinct acoustic events, separated by 0.8 seconds. Less than a second, but clearly distinguishable in the high-fidelity recordings the IUSS system captured. The first event matched the expected signature of a pressure hull failure at depth. A sharp, powerful acoustic pulse, the sound of air-filled space suddenly collapsing under immense pressure. That was Titan imploding. But the second event, 0.8 seconds later, was different. The acoustic signature showed a different frequency profile, a different duration, and a different apparent point of origin. It was close to Titan, very close, but not the same location. The report's conclusion, partially redacted, suggested two possibilities. Either Titan imploded in stages, with different sections of the hull failing in rapid succession, or something else collapsed or impacted the ocean floor at nearly the same moment. The report recommended further analysis. That's where the document ended. Elias found no evidence that further analysis was ever conducted, or if it was buried deeper than he could dig. But the implications were staggering. If something else created an acoustic signature at the moment Titan imploded, what was it? And was it cause or coincidence? Part 7. The warning they ignored. As Elias dug deeper into OceanGate's history, he discovered that the problems with Titan went back much further than anyone publicly acknowledged. In 2019, 4 years before the disaster, Titan underwent a test dive that was aborted under concerning circumstances. The publicly available information about this dive was minimal. A test was conducted, some data was gathered, the dive ended early, end of story. But Elias found references to an internal report from that dive buried in technical forums where former OceanGate contractors sometimes posted anonymously. The 2019 test dive reached a depth of approximately 3,500 metres, just slightly shallower than the Titanic wreck site. During the dive, Titan's monitoring systems detected what the report called unexplained acoustic spikes. The hull stress sensors showed pressure distortions that didn't match modelled expectations, and most concerning, there was a notation about unknown external contact. Something touched the submersible, or got very close to it, at 3,500 metres depth in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The dive was aborted immediately. Titan returned to the surface. Engineers examined every inch of the hull and found nothing wrong. No damage, no stress marks, no evidence of contact with anything. So they did what organisations often do when faced with an anomaly that can't be explained or repeated. They noted it in their records, decided it must have been a sensor glitch or a data interpretation error and moved on. But now Elias thought, what if it wasn't a glitch? What if in 2019 Titan encountered the same thing it would encounter fatally in 2023? And what if the difference was that in 2019 they turned back? He tried to find the engineers who worked on that 2019 analysis. 2 of them no longer worked in the maritime industry. One had moved to aerospace, another was working in renewable energy. When Elias contacted them through carefully worded LinkedIn messages, both declined to discuss their time at OceanGate, citing non-disclosure agreements. But one engineer, who requested absolute anonymity, sent Elias a brief message. We found microscopic stress patterns in the hull after that dive that shouldn't have been there. Not from internal pressure, from external. Like something pressed against the hull with immense force, but only for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to cause failure, but long enough to leave a signature in the material structure. We were told to note it and move on. I think about that a lot now. Part 8. The Corridor. Everyone monitors. Marcus Webb, the retired Navy acoustic technician, told Elias something during their meeting that opened an entirely new line of investigation. You need to understand something about that area of the Atlantic, Webb said. The region around the Titanic wreck is one of the most acoustically monitored sections of ocean in the world. Elias was surprised. Why? It's not near any major shipping lanes. It's not strategically important. Webb smiled grimly. That's what makes it perfect. It's quiet. Background noise is minimal. Sound propagates clearly through the water column. During the Cold War, both we and the Soviets used that area as a reference point for calibrating acoustic systems. We knew the baseline acoustic signature of that region better than almost anywhere else in the ocean. So when something moves through there, when something creates sound, we notice. So the Navy would have known if there were any submarines in the area when Titan went down. Absolutely. They would have known about any vessel, any significant biological activity, any geological events. That corridor is transparent to acoustic monitoring. Nothing moves down there without someone hearing it. Then why, Elias asked, did the public receive so little information about what was detected? Webb's expression darkened. That's the question, isn't it? Either they detected nothing unusual, which seems unlikely given the anomalous signatures they admitted to, or they detected something they don't want to discuss. Elias spent the next several days researching the acoustic history of the Titanic wreck region. What he found was fascinating and disturbing. Since the 1980s, when the wreck was first discovered, there had been sporadic reports of unusual acoustic phenomena in the area. Nothing that made headlines, just footnotes in oceanographic research papers, metallic echoes that didn't correspond to the wreck itself, high-strength reflective signatures suggesting large metal objects in areas where no objects were charted, and occasional reports of objects moving faster than known submersibles or marine life could move at those depths. Every time these anomalies were detected, they were attributed to equipment malfunction, acoustic reflections from the wreck creating false images, or misidentification of known phenomena, standard scientific explanations for non-standard observations. But taken together, over decades, they painted a picture of a region where strange things happened with just enough regularity to be notable, but not enough to trigger serious investigation. Until now. Until Titan. Part 9. Nargeolet's Secret Map. Paul-Henri Nargeolet was 77 years old when he died aboard Titan. He'd spent decades exploring the Titanic wreck, earning the nickname Mr. Titanic. He knew that wreck site better than perhaps anyone alive. He'd documented it, studied it, and helped recover thousands of artifacts from the debris field. After the disaster, Nargeolet's contributions to Titanic research were widely celebrated. But Elias became interested in something else, what Nargeolet had been researching in the years before his death. Through contacts in the maritime archaeology community, Elias learned that Nargeolet had been working on a comprehensive sonar mapping project of the area surrounding the Titanic wreck. Not just the wreck itself, but the ocean floor for several kilometres in every direction. This wasn't public work, it was personal research, conducted during his many dives to the site. Nargeolet had apparently become fascinated by geological formations in the region, particularly to the east of the wreck. Elias managed to speak with a French oceanographer who had collaborated with Nargeolet on some projects. The oceanographer, who spoke on condition of anonymity, told Elias something remarkable. Paul found something unusual about 2 kilometres east of the Titanic, the oceanographer said. He showed me sonar images from one of his dives in 2021. There was a structure on the ocean floor that didn't match the surrounding geology. Very straight edges, almost geometric. Paul was fascinated by it. He called it Site Z. Just a designation he made up. He wanted to do a proper survey of it, but there was never time during the official Titanic dives. What did he think it was? Elias asked. He didn't speculate much. Paul was very careful about that, but he said the formation had anomalous geometry. That was his phrase. He thought it might be an unusual geological feature, possibly a rock formation shaped by ancient currents. But he also said the angles were too precise for natural formation. He wanted to investigate further. Elias felt a chill. Do you know if the Titan dive on June 18th was planning to visit Site Z? The oceanographer paused. I don't know for certain, but Paul mentioned to me in May that he was hoping to finally get a close look at the structure. He said this might be his last season diving at those depths, and he wanted to see it before he stopped. Elias tried to obtain Nargeolet's sonar maps. He contacted archives, research institutions, and personal associates. What he discovered was frustrating. Nargeolet's personal research materials had been collected by his family and were not available for review. Requests through official channels were politely declined. But Elias did find something, a presentation Nargeolet had given at a small maritime conference in 2022. The presentation was about advanced sonar techniques for wreck site mapping. Most of it was technical, but there was one slide near the end that caught Elias's attention. It showed a sonar image, high resolution, of the ocean floor. In the centre of the image was a formation that looked nothing like the surrounding sediment and rock. It was angular, with straight edges and what appeared to be right-angle corners. The slide had minimal text, just a location designation. 41 degrees, 43 minutes north, 49 degrees, 56 minutes west. Elias checked those coordinates, approximately 1,600 metres east of the Titanic wreck. Site Z. Part 10. The Deviation. Nobody mentioned. Titan's descent on June 18th should have been routine. Straight down to the Titanic wreck site, perhaps a slight adjustment for currents, but essentially a vertical descent to a precise location. Using publicly available data about the last known position of Titan's support ship and the known location of the Titanic wreck, Elias began reconstructing the submersible's dive path. He factored in typical current patterns for that region and time of year, the known drift rate of objects descending at the speed Titan would have been travelling, and the established protocols OceanGate used for approaching the wreck site. What he found was subtle but significant. Based on the timing of Titan's last communication and the location where debris was eventually found, the submersible appeared to have deviated from the standard approach path. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The deviation was to the east, towards Site Z. Elias couldn't prove that Titan intentionally headed toward the anomalous formation Nargeolet had been studying. The deviation could have been caused by currents, by a navigation adjustment, by any number of mundane factors. But the direction and magnitude of the deviation were consistent with a course change designed to bring Titan within visual range of coordinates, located 1,600 metres east of the Titanic. More significant, this deviation was not mentioned in any official briefing or investigation summary that Elias could find. The public narrative was that Titan was descending directly to the Titanic when it imploded, but the debris field location suggested otherwise. Why wasn't this mentioned? It could be simple oversight. In the chaos of the investigation and the tragedy of the loss, a minor course deviation might not have seemed important. But to Elias, it suggested something else. If Titan was approaching Site Z, and if that's where something went wrong, then acknowledging the deviation would raise questions about what they were doing there and what they might have found. Part 11. The structure beneath the wreck. Elias needed better data about what was actually on the ocean floor at Site Z. Sonar images from Nargile's presentation were provocative, but not conclusive. He needed to know if other researchers had detected the same anomaly. This led him to the archives of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, one of the premier deep ocean research organisations in the world. Woods Hole had been involved in finding the Titanic wreck in 1985 and had conducted numerous surveys of the area in subsequent years. Elias submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for historical sonar data from the Titanic wreck region. Months passed with no response. He followed up repeatedly. Finally, he received a package containing digital files of sonar surveys conducted in the late 1990s. What he found in those surveys was extraordinary. A 1998 comprehensive mapping project had documented a large, unusual formation, approximately 2 kilometres east-northeast of the Titanic wreck. The formation was described in technical notes as an unidentified seafloor feature, designated Feature 17B. The sonar images showed a structure with distinctly geometric characteristics. It appeared triangular in plan view, with edges that were remarkably straight given the chaotic nature of natural ocean floor formations. The formation was large, roughly 100 metres along its longest axis, and appeared to rise several metres above the surrounding sediment. Most intriguingly, the feature showed uniform acoustic reflectivity, suggesting it was composed of consistent material throughout, unlike the mixed sediment, rock, and debris typical of the ocean floor in that region. The survey report noted that Feature 17B represented an interesting geological phenomenon and recommended further investigation. As far as Elias could determine, no further investigation was ever conducted, or if it was, the results were not publicly available. Elias consulted with a geological oceanographer about the formation. He sent the sonar images without context, simply asking for an interpretation. The oceanographer's response was cautious, but intrigued. "This is unusual. The geometry is very regular, more regular than I'd expect from natural processes. It could be a rock formation that's been shaped by currents over millennia, but those edges are remarkably straight. It could be a type of sediment deposit, with unusual consolidation properties, or it could be something else entirely. I'd need much higher resolution imaging and possibly core samples to say definitively. Where is this located?" When Elias told him, the oceanographer went silent for a moment, then said, "That's near the Titanic. Has anyone investigated this recently?" "Not that I can find." "That's surprising. You'd think with all the traffic to that wreck site, someone would have taken a closer look at anything unusual in the area. Unless," Elias thought, "someone had taken a closer look and didn't like what they found." Part 12, The Last Image. Elias's investigation had assembled a circumstantial case that something unusual existed at Site Z, that Titan may have approached it, and that the submersible experienced external pressure events consistent with encountering something unexpected. But he had no direct evidence of what the Titan crew actually saw. Then he received a second anonymous message. This one came through an encrypted communication service, far more sophisticated than the original email. The message was brief. "Check the recovered control systems. File path recovered fragments / viewport camera / cache June 18. Titan's debris had been recovered and was under the custody of the National Transportation Safety Board. Some of that debris included electronic components from the submersible's control systems. Officially, no usable data had been recovered. The violence of the implosion and the subsequent time in saltwater had destroyed storage media and corrupted any data that might have survived. But Elias's anonymous source was suggesting otherwise. He spent weeks trying to figure out how to access or even verify the existence of recovered data files. He contacted people involved in the debris recovery, people involved in the investigation, and people who worked in data forensics. Nobody would acknowledge that recoverable data existed. Then, 3 months after the disaster, a small article appeared in a technical journal about advances in recovering data from damaged storage media, specifically mentioning work being done on the Titan investigation. The article was quickly retracted, with a note that it contained premature information, but Elias had saved a copy. The article mentioned that forensic specialists had successfully extracted partial files from a damaged solid-state drive recovered from Titan's control tablet. Most of the data was corrupted, but some image files had been partially reconstructed. Elias pulled every string he had, called in every favour, and eventually, through a chain of contacts that he would never fully reveal, obtained a file. A single image file, low resolution, partially corrupted, with large sections of missing data. But what remained was extraordinary. The image showed the view from Titan's viewport. The timestamp embedded in the file metadata read June 18th, 2023, 0853 Coordinated Universal Time. 2 minutes before the pressure anomaly, 1 minute before Titan's last partial message. The image was dark, as would be expected at that depth, with only Titan's external lights for illumination. But in the illuminated area there was something that didn't look like ocean floor, didn't look like the Titanic wreck, didn't look like anything Elias had ever seen in deep ocean photography. There was a surface, smooth, reflective, catching the light from Titan's floods. The reflectivity suggested metal, though it was impossible to be certain. And there was an edge, a sharp right angle where this surface met another surface perpendicular to it. The image was too corrupted to show more. Large sections of pixels were simply black, missing data. But in the remaining fragments, Elias could make out what appeared to be a corridor or opening, shadows suggesting depth beyond the visible surface, straight lines that spoke of artificial construction, not natural formation. It was only one image. It could have been an artifact of the corruption, pixels randomly aligning to create the illusion of structure. It could have been a reflection or an optical effect Elias wasn't understanding correctly. But it could also have been exactly what it appeared to be, a photograph of something artificial at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Part 13. The Contact. Elias knew he was onto something significant. He'd been careful, using encryption, compartmentalizing his sources, not publishing anything publicly, but someone was paying attention. His phone rang one evening in late September, 3 months after the disaster. The number was blocked. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. North? A voice, male, professional, unaccented. Who is this? That's not important. What's important is that you stop investigating the structure. Elias felt his pulse quicken. What structure? You know what structure. The formation near the Titanic wreck. The deviation in Titan's descent path. The thing you've been building a case around. Stop. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the vessel failure. Titan failed because of structural inadequacies in its pressure hull. That's been established. Anything else you're pursuing is a distraction. Who are you? Elias asked again. Someone who's trying to help you avoid making a significant mistake. You're a respected analyst. You have a good reputation. Publishing conspiracy theories about secret structures on the ocean floor will destroy that reputation, and it won't accomplish anything. Are you saying there's no structure? A pause. I'm saying that what is or isn't on the ocean floor at that location is irrelevant to the Titan investigation. Then it shouldn't matter if I keep looking. Mr. North, please understand this carefully. There are things in the ocean that are best left undisturbed. The Titan tragedy was about engineering failure and poor decision-making. Making it about anything else serves no one. Walk away from this. And if I don't, the voice remained calm, then you'll find that your sources dry up, your reputation suffers, and your investigation leads nowhere. We're not threatening you, we're advising you, for your own benefit. The call ended. Elias sat in his apartment staring at his phone. The call had confirmed everything. There was something at Site Z. Titan had approached it, and someone with significant resources wanted the whole thing buried alongside the submersible. He immediately began backing up all his files to multiple secure locations. He documented the phone call. He prepared a summary of everything he'd found just in case. 3 days later, he woke up to find his computer's hard drive corrupted. All his local files were gone. His cloud storage accounts had been accessed and wiped. The backup drives he kept in a locked drawer had been remotely formatted. Everything was gone. Everything except the copies he'd hidden in places that weren't connected to any network, the files he'd stored on old USB drives and kept in a safe deposit box, the printed documents he'd mailed to himself and left unopened. Whoever had warned him had followed through. They demonstrated their capability, but they hadn't been quite thorough enough. Part 14. The Final Clue. Elias was scared, but also energised. The deletion of his files proved he was onto something real. You don't suppress information unless that information matters. He spent weeks being paranoid, checking for surveillance, varying his routines, communicating only through encrypted channels. He started rebuilding his research from the hidden backups, but he did it carefully, offline, with no digital footprint. Then, in mid-October, he received one more anonymous communication. This time it was a physical letter, delivered to a P.O. box he maintained under a different name. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration header. The message was brief. The ocean floor holds things older than the wreck. They didn't want tourists finding out. Attached to the paper was a photograph, high resolution, professional quality, clearly taken by a remotely operated vehicle or submersible equipped with proper lighting. The image showed a section of ocean floor, sediment and rock, and embedded in that rock was a panel. Metal, clearly artificial, roughly 2 meters square. The panel showed signs of corrosion but was still intact. And on the panel's surface, just barely visible under the marine growth, was an edge, a right angle identical to what Elias had seen in the corrupted image from Titan. The photograph had no location data, no timestamp, no context, just the image and that single sentence message. Elias studied the photograph for hours. The metal was definitely artificial. The right angle was too precise to be natural, and the way it was embedded in the rock suggested it had been there for a very long time, not decades, possibly centuries. The surrounding geology showed no signs of recent disturbance. Whatever this was, it had been on the ocean floor near the Titanic wreck for a long time, long enough for rock to partially cover it, long enough for marine growth to obscure its features, but not long enough to be eroded away or consumed by corrosion. Elias considered what he knew. There was an anomalous formation at Site Z. That formation had geometric features inconsistent with natural geology. Nargilé had known about it and wanted to investigate it. Titan had deviated toward it during its final dive. The submersible had experienced external pressure anomalies. The crew had sent messages suggesting they saw something unexpected, and then Titan had imploded, possibly coincidentally, possibly not. And now someone had sent him proof that there was indeed something artificial at that location, something old, something someone very much wanted to keep secret. Part 15. The upload. Elias knew he had to release what he'd found. Keeping it to himself served no purpose, and if something happened to him, the information would be lost. But releasing it through traditional channels would get it suppressed immediately. Academic journals would reject it. Maritime organisations would discredit it. The story would be killed before it ever reached the public. So he did what whistleblowers in the digital age do. He prepared a comprehensive report, including all his evidence, all his sources, all his analysis. He encrypted it and uploaded it to multiple secure platforms. He sent links to journalists, researchers and activists he trusted. He posted it on forums dedicated to deep-sea mysteries and maritime anomalies. The last line of his report read, "The Titan didn't fail because of bad engineering alone. It failed because it got too close to something it wasn't supposed to find. Something that's been hidden at the bottom of the Atlantic for longer than anyone wants to admit. Something that raises questions our institutions aren't prepared to answer." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the report was being shared across the internet. News outlets picked up the story. Other researchers came forward with their own anomalous findings from the Titanic wreck region. The conspiracy gained momentum, and then, 24 hours after Elias posted his report, every link went dead. Every copy of the file showed as corrupted or deleted. The forums where he'd posted were suddenly offline for maintenance. Journalists who'd contacted him stopped responding. The story disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, scrubbed from the internet by forces with resources Elias couldn't match. He tried to repost. He created new accounts, used different platforms, sent out new copies of the file, but each time, within hours, everything was deleted. Someone was monitoring the entire internet for any mention of his research and removing it faster than he could spread it. 1 week after his initial upload, Elias received a final message. It came through an encrypted channel he'd thought was secure. Just 3 words: "Stop now, please." Elias made one last attempt. He contacted a documentary filmmaker he knew, someone with a reputation for investigating controversial topics. They agreed to meet in person. No electronic communication, no paper trail. The meeting never happened. Elias didn't show up. Calls to his phone went to voicemail. His apartment was found empty, with no signs of struggle, no indication of where he'd gone. Elias North hasn't been heard from since November 2023. His family filed a missing person report. Police investigated and found no evidence of foul play. His bank accounts haven't been accessed. His phone hasn't been used. He simply vanished. Some say he went into hiding. Some say he was silenced. Some say he never existed at all. That the whole investigation was an elaborate internet hoax. But copies of his report still circulate in the darkest corners of the internet, on encrypted networks, in private forums where people trade information too dangerous to share openly. And people who've read it, people who understand what it implies, look at maps of the Atlantic Ocean a little differently now. Because somewhere, 2.5 miles beneath the surface near the wreck of the Titanic, there is something that shouldn't be there. Something old. Something hidden. Something that 5 people got too close to on June 18th, 2023. And the official story, the one about engineering failure and poor decision-making, is true as far as it goes. It just doesn't go far enough. Epilogue. Questions without answers. The OceanGate Titan disaster killed 5 people and ended a company. Investigations determined that the submersible's carbon fibre hull was inadequate for repeated deep dives, that safety protocols were insufficient, that warnings were ignored. All of that is true and documented. But the questions Elias North raised remain unanswered. Why were pressure anomalies detected weeks before the final dive? Why were text messages referencing visual and acoustic anomalies never released? Why did acoustic monitoring detect 2 distinct events during the implosion? What is the geometric formation at Site Z? Why did Titan appear to deviate toward that location? What did the partially recovered image actually show? These questions make people uncomfortable, because they suggest the disaster wasn't just about corporate recklessness and engineering failure. They suggest there was something else involved, something that doesn't fit the narrative we've been told, and maybe that's the point. Maybe some truths are too complicated, too disruptive, too unsettling to acknowledge. Maybe it's easier to accept a story about human error than to confront the possibility that there are things in our ocean we don't understand, things we've been carefully avoiding for reasons we're not privy to. The ocean covers 70% of our planet. We've explored perhaps 5% of it in any meaningful detail. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the deepest parts of our own ocean. And in those unexplored depths, in the crushing pressure and absolute darkness, there might be things that have been there longer than human civilization. Things that weren't meant to be found. Things that powerful institutions have known about and decided to keep secret. The Titan is gone. The 5 people aboard are gone. Elias North is gone. But the questions remain, floating in the dark water, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to ask them. And somewhere, 2.5 miles down, Site Z is still there, still geometric, still anomalous, still waiting. That's the story of the pressure. Files, the investigation that disappeared, and the questions nobody wants answered. Make of it what you will. Draw your own conclusions, but the next time you hear about deep-sea exploration, about submersibles diving to historic wrecks, about the mysteries of the ocean floor, remember that there are some places where, maybe, just maybe, we're not supposed to go. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this documentary, please use your hype points on the video. It genuinely helps us more than you can imagine. And let us know in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. We love connecting with all of you around the world. Until next time, this is Sleep Theories, where the truth is always deeper than it seems. What if the deadliest attack on a United States naval vessel since World War II wasn't an accident at all? What if 34 Americans died not in confusion, but as collateral damage in a weapons test so secret that the US government spent 50 years burying the truth beneath layers of classified silence? Before we dive into this story, I want to give a massive thank you to Mr. Hill420 and so many others who suggested this topic. Your curiosity drives these investigations, and I'm grateful for it. If you have ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. Now let's explore what really happened on June 8th, 1967 in the Eastern Mediterranean, and why the echoes of that day still reverberate through classified channels today. Act 1. The Silence Before the Storm. June 8th, 1967, 1400 local time. Eastern Mediterranean, 25 nautical miles off the Sinai coast. The USS Liberty cut through calm waters under a flawless Mediterranean sky. At 455 feet long and displacing over 10,000 tons, the modified Victory-class cargo ship looked unremarkable, a rusting relic of World War II pressed back into service. But appearances deceived. Bristling with antennas, microwave dishes, and SIGINT collection arrays, Liberty was the NSA's floating ear in the Middle East, listening to a region on the brink of tearing itself apart. The Six-Day War had erupted 4 days earlier. Regional powers clashed across ancient battlefields, while Cold War superpowers watched nervously from the sidelines. The Soviet Mediterranean squadron lurked just over the horizon. American forces maintained a tense neutrality. And through it all, Liberty listened. Below decks, in the cramped research spaces that reeked of coffee, cigarette smoke and hot electronics, 45 cryptologic technicians from the Naval Security Group worked in shifts. They monitored everything: military communications, diplomatic channels, encrypted transmissions from ships and aircraft across the region. Every signal, every transmission, every whispered order flowed through their receivers and into the classified intelligence pipeline feeding Fort Meade, Maryland. Petty Officer First Class Mark Reynolds had been on station for 6 hours straight. At 24 years old, he possessed the kind of focused intensity that made him perfect for signals intelligence work, able to distinguish signal from noise in the chaotic electromagnetic spectrum of a war zone. His station monitored multiple frequencies, including those reserved for American military operations. At 14:13, Reynolds's headphones crackled with a transmission that made him straighten in his chair. The signal came through on a frequency that shouldn't have been active, a restricted channel reserved for classified naval operations. The encryption pattern was sophisticated, military grade, but something felt wrong. Reynolds keyed his recorder and leaned closer. "Shadow 7 to Cyan Control," a voice said in clear English with an American accent. "Phase 2 parameters confirmed. Frequency modulation holding at 7.83 Hz. Standing by for sequence initiation." Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. Cyan Control? That designation didn't appear in any briefing material, and that frequency, 7.83 Hz, meant nothing to him in military terms. He scribbled notes frantically. A second voice responded, also American, clipped and efficient. "Cyan Control confirms. Maintain visual contact with target vessel until phase termination. Weather conditions optimal. Execute on my mark." "Target vessel?" Reynolds' hand moved to the intercom switch to alert the communications officer, but he hesitated. Intercepting US military communications wasn't unusual. The NSA gathered signals from American forces routinely for training and verification purposes. But this felt different. That frequency, the deliberate emphasis on visual contact, the designation Cyan. He never got the chance to report it. At 14:14, the radar operator 2 compartments forward shouted into the circuit. Multiple surface contacts bearing 090, range 30 miles and closing. Fast movers. Confirmed aircraft. On the bridge, Commander William McGonigal lowered his binoculars and squinted into the eastern sky. He'd been tracking distant aircraft for the past 20 minutes, reconnaissance flights he'd assumed. The Liberty flew an American flag the size of a garage door. The hull number was clearly visible. In these conditions, with visibility exceeding 10 miles and zero wind, there was no possibility of confusion. At 14:15, 3 unidentified jet fighters dropped from high altitude and screamed toward the Liberty at 500 knots. The first indication of hostile intent came not from weapons but from proximity. The aircraft circled the ship 3 times, low enough that sailors on deck could see them clearly. Some waved, assuming they were friendly forces. A few took photographs. Then the fighters banked hard and lined up for attack runs. What happened next would be disputed for decades, analysed frame by frame, dissected in naval courts and congressional hearings. But for the men aboard Liberty, the truth was simple and absolute. They were being attacked by unidentified forces. The first cannon rounds shredded the forward antennas at 14:16. Radar dishes exploded in sparks. Communications arrays tumbled into the sea. The aircraft made multiple passes, their weapons stitching lines of destruction across the deck and superstructure. Commander McGonigal stood on the bridge wing, fully exposed, shouting orders as shrapnel tore through steel around him. He wouldn't leave his post, wouldn't abandon the con even as the windows exploded inward and instrument panels sparked and died. Below decks, Reynolds clutched his headphones as the compartment shook. The overhead lights flickered. Then, through the static and interference, he heard it again. That American voice. Calm and analytical. Sine wave sequence maintaining coherence. Phase 2 progressing nominally. His recorder was still running. At 14:24, the fighters broke off. For 8 minutes, an eerie quiet descended. Damage control teams scrambled topside. The wounded screamed for corpsmen. Fires burned in 3 compartments. Then sonar picked up high-speed screws. 3 unidentified torpedo boats emerged from the coastal haze, their decks crowded with sailors manning deck guns. They opened fire immediately, 40mm and 20mm rounds hammering the Liberty's hull, shredding life rafts, killing sailors who'd made it to the deck. At 14:31, one of the boats fired a torpedo. The torpedo struck the Liberty on the starboard side, below the waterline, directly beneath the signal's intelligence spaces. The explosion ripped through the research compartments like a fist through tissue paper. Bulkheads buckled. Seawater rushed in. 25 men died instantly, crushed or drowned in the flooding. Mark Reynolds survived only because he'd been thrown against a bulkhead by the blast. Unconscious, bleeding, half submerged in rising water, he clutched his recorder as shipmates dragged him through the darkness toward the ladders. The attack continued for another 40 minutes. By the time the attacking forces withdrew at 15:30, Liberty was a floating wreck. 34 men were dead. 171 were wounded. The ship listed heavily to starboard, fires still burning, taking on water. But she didn't sink, and below decks, in the flooded research spaces, a magnetic tape labelled Sine Wave Intercept 6867 floated in the darkness, sealed inside Reynolds's waterproof recorder bag. Act 2. The Inquiry. September the 1967. Naval Court of Inquiry. Malta. The official inquiry convened 3 months after the attack, far from American shores and prying media. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd Jr. presided, a stern-faced officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for thorough investigation. The court's mandate was clear: determine what happened, who was responsible, and whether Liberty's crew bore any fault for their own casualties. From the beginning, something felt wrong. Witnesses testified to crystal-clear weather, a clearly marked American flag, the ship's hull number visible for miles. They described the methodical nature of the assault, not frenzied combat, but deliberate targeting of antennas and communications equipment. Some testified to seeing torpedo boats machine-gunning life rafts. The official explanation came swiftly: a case of mistaken identity during a chaotic regional conflict. Foreign forces had confused Liberty for an enemy vessel. Tragic but understandable in the fog of war. Sincere apologies. Compensation offered. The American government accepted this explanation within hours of the attack, but the evidence suggested otherwise. On the third day of testimony, Mark Reynolds took the stand. His face was still mottled with burn scars, his left hand bandaged. He walked with a pronounced limp. The court recorder noted that he seemed nervous, kept glancing at the door. Admiral Kidd asked him to describe his duties on June 8th. Reynolds began with routine details, his station, his assignment, the frequencies he monitored. Then he paused. "Sir, I need to submit evidence," Reynolds said quietly. "What sort of evidence, Petty Officer?" "An audio recording. I made it during the attack. It contains transmissions I intercepted on a secure frequency. American voices coordinating the attack sequence." The courtroom went silent. Kidd leaned forward. "You recorded American personnel coordinating an attack on an American vessel." "I don't know what I recorded, sir. But the voices were American. They used a designation I'd never heard before, Cyan Wave. They spoke about phase sequences, frequency modulation, maintaining visual contact with the target vessel." Reynolds produced a reel-to-reel tape from a canvas bag, labelled in his own handwriting. "Cyan Wave Intercept 6867. The Navy lawyer immediately objected. The tape hadn't been submitted through proper evidence channels. Its chain of custody was questionable. Reynolds himself admitted he'd kept it hidden for 3 months, afraid of what might happen if he turned it over. Admiral Kidd examined the tape without playing it. "This will be entered into evidence and reviewed by appropriate authorities. Petty Officer Reynolds, you are to discuss this with no one outside this court. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." The tape was logged as Evidence Item 47B, placed in a sealed envelope and transferred to a secure evidence locker. It vanished. No official record of the tape exists in the declassified inquiry documents. Reynolds' testimony about it was redacted from the public version of the proceedings. When he tried to follow up weeks later, he was told the tape had been misplaced during transfer to NSA custody for technical analysis. 3 months later, Reynolds received orders to a submarine tender in the Pacific. His security clearance was administratively reduced. His service record noted, "Not recommended for cryptologic assignments." He never spoke publicly about Liberty or Cyan Wave again. Fort Meade, Maryland, November 1967. NASA headquarters. Linda Baker had worked for the National Security Agency for 11 years, analysing signals intelligence from every corner of the globe. At 36, she was one of the senior analysts in the Naval SIGINT Division, trusted with the most sensitive intercepts. In November 1967, she was tasked with reviewing backup recordings from the Liberty attack, part of the NSA's internal assessment of what went wrong with their intelligence collection that day. The work was tedious. Hours of radio chatter, static, routine military communications. But Baker had a gift for pattern recognition, for seeing anomalies others missed. On her 4th day reviewing the backups, she noticed something odd. At several points during the attack, 1414, 1422, 1429 and 1441, her spectrum analysis showed unusual electromagnetic activity. Brief bursts of extremely low-frequency interference, lasting only seconds but powerful enough to partially distort other signals. She ran the frequencies through analysis software, 7.83 Hz, repeating. Baker frowned. That frequency was known as the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's ionosphere, created by lightning discharges globally. It had nothing to do with military communications. Radio equipment didn't operate at that frequency. It was too low, too weak, essentially background noise of the planet itself. So why did it appear in military signal intercepts at the exact moments of Liberty's attack phases? She wrote a technical memo and submitted it through channels. The response came back 3 days later. Technical artifact. Atmospheric interference. No intelligence value. But Baker wasn't satisfied. She cross-referenced the timing against the attack timeline reconstructed from survivor testimony. The frequency spikes occurred precisely when aircraft began their runs, when the torpedo boats opened fire, when the torpedo was launched. Not random atmospheric interference, Coordinated. She tried to dig deeper, requesting access to Liberty's raw intercept logs, the unprocessed recordings captured by the ship's equipment. Her request was denied. Those materials were classified at a level above your current access. Linda Baker had top-secret clearance. What could be above that? She tried a different approach. Using her access to the NSA's internal file system, she searched for any mention of cyan wave. One result appeared, a project file from 1965, heavily redacted, sponsored jointly by DARPA and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The project number was CW-12/7. The file contained only 3 pages. Most of it was blacked out, but one paragraph remained visible. Project Cyan Wave explores applications of extremely low-frequency electromagnetic modulation for tactical radar signature manipulation. Testing requires controlled combat environment with multiple sensor platforms. Operational security classification, Cosmic Top Secret. Cosmic Top Secret was a NATO designation, higher than anything in the standard US classification system. Baker printed the page, then immediately regretted it. She looked around her cubicle, suddenly paranoid. This wasn't just classified. This was the kind of material people's careers ended over. She folded the page into her purse and deleted her search history. That night she typed a summary of her findings and mailed it to herself at her home address. If something happened to her at work, if these files disappeared, or she was suddenly reassigned, at least she'd have proof she'd seen them. 2 weeks later, her supervisor called her into a meeting. NSA Security was conducting a routine review of database access logs. Nothing to worry about, just standard procedure. They asked her about her search for cyan wave. Baker kept her face neutral. I came across the term in a Liberty Intercept backup and wanted to understand the context. And did you? No, the file was mostly redacted. The security officer smiled. Good. That means the classification system is working. In the future, if you encounter project names you don't recognize, please submit an information request through proper channels rather than searching directly. Understood. Understood. She wasn't reassigned. Her clearance wasn't revoked, but the message was clear. Some doors stay closed. Linda Baker returned to her routine work, analysing intercepts from Vietnam and the Soviet Union. She never searched for cyan wave again, but she kept that printed page hidden in a safety deposit box. Act 3. The Declassified Ghost. 2003 to 2017. The Long Thaw. In the years following the Cold War's end, the intelligence community slowly began declassifying historical materials under the Freedom of Information Act. Thousands of pages from the 1960s and 70s filtered into public archives, NSA operational summaries, CIA memoranda, military intelligence assessments. The USS Liberty attack, still controversial decades later, attracted particular attention from researchers and conspiracy theorists. Survivors had formed advocacy groups. Journalists had written books questioning the official mistaken identity narrative. The government maintained its story quietly but firmly. In 2003, the NSA released the first batch of Liberty-related intercepts, heavily redacted but enough to confirm that the agency had been monitoring communications in real time during the attack. Linda Baker, now retired and 72 years old, read about the release in the Washington Post. She'd thought about that day in 1967 occasionally over the decades, wondered what had really happened to that tape, whether anyone else had noticed those strange frequency spikes. She requested her old security clearance be reactivated, a privilege available to retired intelligence personnel for consulting work. The approval took 6 months, but eventually she received her credentials and access to the NSA's historical archives in College Park, Maryland. She spent 3 weeks reading through the declassified Liberty materials. Most of it she'd seen before, the attack timeline, intercept summaries, damage reports. But then she noticed something. In the official NSA summary from June 1967, the page numbers jumped. Page 13 was followed by page 15. Page 14 was missing. Baker checked the original classification log. Page 14 had been titled Classified Naval Operations, Coordination with Advanced Research Projects. That page remained classified. She submitted a FOIA request for page 14 specifically. The response took 2 years. Denied. Material still classified in the interest of national security. But Baker had spent 11 years at NSA. She knew how to read around redactions, how to find information in metadata and file structures. She started pulling every document from 1967 that referenced classified naval operations in the Mediterranean. Most were routine: submarine deployments, carrier group movements, Soviet naval tracking operations. Then she found it. A budget document from early 1967, listing project expenditures for the Office of Naval Research. Buried in a table of appropriations, CW 12/7, Field Test Coordination, $8.7 million. The date range, May 15th, 1967 to June 30th, 1967, exactly covering the period of the Six-Day War. Baker's hands trembled as she photographed the page with her phone. After 50 years, proof that sine wave wasn't a phantom, wasn't something she'd imagined. She kept digging. Over the next 2 years she found fragments. A 1968 memo from DARPA referencing successful field demonstration of phase cancellation radar spoofing technology in operational environment. A 1970 patent application, US Patent 5,159,703, for electromagnetic signature modulation device, listing 3 inventors from Raytheon Advanced Systems and the Naval Research Laboratory. A 1982 intelligence report on Soviet radar capabilities noting, Soviet naval defense systems exhibit vulnerability to low-frequency phase modulation, similar to effects observed during classified operations in 1967. The pattern was unmistakable. Sine wave had been real, it had been tested, and Liberty had been there when it happened. But why attack the ship? If Liberty was collecting data for the NSA, if this was an American military operation, why would they attack their own intelligence vessel? Unless Liberty wasn't supposed to be there, unless the ship's presence was unauthorized, and its advanced listening equipment threatened to record something that was never meant to be recorded. Unless Liberty itself was the target, not by foreign forces, but by elements within the US military, conducting a weapons test that required complete secrecy. 2017. The breakthrough. In March 2017, the NSA released another batch of Liberty documents, the most extensive yet, over 3,000 pages. Researchers around the world began combing through them. Linda Baker, now 86 and fighting lung cancer, received a call from James Wilson, a historian at the Naval War College who'd been studying Liberty for 2 decades. "Linda, I found something," Wilson said, "in the intercept logs. There's a reference to your name." "What kind of reference?" "A memo from December 1967. Subject: Analyst concerns regarding low-frequency interference in Liberty intercepts. It says you submitted a technical report about unusual electromagnetic readings during the attack. Did you?" "Yes. They told me it was atmospheric interference. The memo says your analysis was forwarded to something called the Advanced Concepts Group for evaluation. That group reported directly to the NSA director. Whatever you found, Linda, it went to the very top." Baker felt a chill. "What else does it say?" "That your findings were consistent with expected technical signatures of active countermeasure systems." "Linda, they knew. They knew what you'd found, and they buried it." "Can you send me that memo?" "Already did. Check your email." Baker opened her laptop with shaking hands. The memo appeared on screen, typed on NSA letterhead, signed by an assistant director whose name had been redacted. One sentence leaped out at her. Analyst Baker's detection of 7.83 Hz modulation during combat operations confirmed successful field implementation of Project CW 12/7 parameters. Successful field implementation? They'd tested their radar spoofing technology using Liberty as an unwitting target, used it to make the ship appear and disappear on radar screens, creating confusion, creating plausible deniability for an attack that would destroy the evidence of the test itself. 34 Americans had died to protect a secret weapons program. But who had conducted the actual attack? Foreign forces used as unwitting proxies, unmarked US aircraft and vessels, mercenaries hired through intelligence cutouts. The memo didn't say. Perhaps that was the final layer of the secret, ensuring that even if the truth about Sine Wave emerged, no one could definitively prove who had pulled the triggers. Baker stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called someone she thought she'd never contact again. Act 4. The recording. 2025, 8 years later, Washington, D.C. Evan Carter was 34 years old and tired of writing about budget hearings and committee appointments for the Washington political blog that employed him. He'd gone into journalism to expose corruption, to hold power accountable. Instead, he spent his days rewriting press releases and attending briefings where nobody said anything real. Then a package arrived at his office with no return address, postmarked from Newport News, Virginia, home to the largest naval shipyard on the East Coast. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape in a waterproof bag, labelled in faded ink, Sine Wave Intercept 6867. Also inside, a typed note on yellowed paper. Mr. Carter, you don't know me, but I know your work. This recording was made aboard USS Liberty during the attack on June 8th, 1967. I was told to destroy it. I couldn't. Before I die, someone should hear what really happened that day. Listen carefully. Look for Sine Wave. They're still using it. MR. Carter's first instinct was to throw it away. Anonymous packages, conspiracy theories about 50-year-old incidents. This was exactly the kind of rabbit hole that destroyed journalists' credibility. But curiosity won. He took the tape to an audio restoration specialist in Baltimore who digitized it for $200 and didn't ask questions. That night, Carter sat in his apartment with noise-cancelling headphones and pressed play. For the first minute, nothing but static and distant voices. Then clearer, military radio traffic, terse commands, acknowledgements. Someone was intercepting operational communications in real time. At timestamp 1413, an American voice cut through. Shadow 7 to Cyan Control. Phase 2 parameters confirmed. Frequency modulation holding at 7.83 Hz. Standing by for sequence initiation. Carter stopped the playback, rewound it, listened again. American voice. American military radio protocol. Speaking about a phase sequence moments before the attack began. He kept listening. At 1416, the sound changed. Loud cracks, metallic impacts, screaming. The attack had begun. Through the chaos, another American voice, older, strained. Cyan Control, this is Liberty Actual. We are under fire. We are a United States vessel. Cease fire. Cease fire. That voice was familiar. Carter paused the recording and pulled up archival footage of Liberty survivors on YouTube. Commander William McGonigal, the ship's captain, giving testimony before Congress in 1982, the same voice. But according to all historical accounts, McGonigal had been on the bridge, fully exposed, with no radio equipment. He'd communicated through the bridge circuit, which had been destroyed in the first minutes of the attack, so how was he on this recording, speaking on a secure frequency that shouldn't have existed? Carter listened to the entire 75 minutes. The attack unfolded in real time. The aircraft, the torpedo boats, the screams, the chaos. And beneath it all, periodically cutting through, those calm American voices. Maintain visual lock, phase progression nominal, data collection continuing. At timestamp 1528, just before the attacking forces withdrew, one final transmission. Cyan Control to all stations, phase termination in 60 seconds, secure all data collection equipment. Shadow 7, confirm recording status. Recording complete, 73 minutes of continuous sensor data. Phase cancellation maintained throughout engagement. Excellent. Return to station. Operation Cyan Wave is concluded. Then silence. Carter sat in the darkness of his apartment, heart pounding. He just listened to evidence of a classified US military operation targeting one of its own ships. Not mistaken identity, not accidental friendly fire, a test. He needed verification. He needed someone who'd understand the technical implications, someone with intelligence community experience. He thought about that note's warning. They're still using it. Using what? Radar spoofing technology? This Cyan Wave system? Carter spent the next week researching. He found Linda Baker's name in declassified NSA documents about Liberty. one of the analysts who'd reviewed the intercepts. She'd be in her 90s now if she was still alive. A record search found her in Arlington, Virginia, age 94, still alive. He called her number. She answered on the 4th ring. "Mrs. Baker, my name is Evan Carter. I'm a journalist in Washington. I have a recording I think you need to hear." "What kind of recording?" "It's labelled Sine Wave Intercept, from June 8th, 1967. The line went silent for so long Carter thought she'd hung up. "Come to my house tomorrow," Baker said finally. "Come alone, bring the recording." Arlington, Virginia, the next day. Linda Baker's home was a small ranch house in a quiet neighbourhood, the yard immaculately maintained, American flag on the porch. Carter knocked, and she answered immediately, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis. "Mr. Carter, come in." Her living room was neat, military precise, walls covered with framed photographs. A younger Baker in the 1960s professional attire, posed with colleagues outside Fort Meade. Citations for distinguished service. A shadow box with medals. Carter set up his laptop and played the recording. Baker listened with her eyes closed, hands folded in her lap. When McGonagall's voice came through, "Cyan Control, this is Liberty Actual," her eyes opened sharply. "That's not possible," she whispered. Carter paused the playback. "What's not possible?" "That voice. That's Commander McGonagall. I heard his testimony before Congress. But he couldn't have been transmitting on that frequency. The bridge communications were destroyed. Unless... Unless what?" Baker stood slowly and walked to a bookshelf. She removed a thick photo album and opened it, revealing not photographs but papers, decades-old documents, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "I kept copies," she said. "Things I wasn't supposed to keep. Things I thought might matter someday." She showed Carter the 1967 memo referencing the 7.83 Hz frequency spikes, the budget document listing sine wave funding, the patent application for electromagnetic signature modulation. It was a test, Baker said. They were testing radar spoofing technology, making ships appear and disappear on radar screens by manipulating extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields. Liberty's sensors were sophisticated enough to detect it to record it, so they had to eliminate the evidence. By attacking their own ship, by creating a plausible cover story, a regional conflict, mistaken identity, fog of war. The attackers, whoever they actually were, could claim confusion. The US government accepts the explanation to protect its weapons program. 34 dead sailors become classified collateral damage. Carter felt sick. But the recording, McGonagall's voice. How? Two possibilities, Baker said. Either there were two separate communication streams, one real, one for the test control, or the recording itself is partially fabricated. Someone created a comprehensive audio record of the operation for documentation purposes, splicing together real combat recordings with test control transmissions. Who would do that? The NSA, DARPA, the Office of Naval Intelligence. Any agency running a black budget program that needs to document results without creating discoverable evidence. Carter thought about the anonymous note. They're still using it. "Mrs. Baker, if this technology existed in 1967, what would it look like now? 58 years of development?" Baker smiled grimly. "Stealth technology, active radar cancellation, electronic warfare systems that can make fighter jets invisible, ships disappear, missiles appear where they aren't. Every major military on Earth now uses descendants of what they tested that day. Can you prove any of this? Not in a way that would hold up in court, not in a way that would force declassification. The people who ordered it are dead. The paper trail is fragments and redactions. All we have are patterns and implications." Carter gestured at his laptop. "We have this recording." "Do we? Where did it come from? Who sent it? Could be authentic. Could be disinformation designed to surface and be debunked, discrediting everyone who takes it seriously. That's how intelligence agencies protect secrets, not by hiding them, but by surrounding them with so much noise that the truth becomes indistinguishable from paranoia." They sat in silence. "What do I do with this?" Carter asked finally. "What every journalist does. You tell the story. You let people decide what they believe. But understand, if you publish this, you'll be attacked. called a conspiracy theorist. Your credibility will be questioned, sources will dry up, and if the recording is real, if there really are people still using this technology, they won't be happy that you've exposed it. Carter looked at the old woman across from him, someone who'd kept these secrets for nearly 60 years, waiting for the right moment. Why didn't you go public, back in 1967 or any time since? Because I wasn't brave enough, Baker said simply, and because I wasn't sure it would matter. The world had moved on. The technology proliferated. What would exposing it accomplish except my own destruction? Then why help me now? Because I'm 94 years old and dying. Because 34 sailors deserve better than being written off as collateral damage in a mistaken identity incident. And because someone sent you that recording for a reason, maybe it's time for the truth. Act 5. The Modern Implication. 3 months later. Evan Carter published his story in The Atlantic. Operation Cyan Wave. New evidence suggests USS Liberty attack was classified US weapons test. The response was immediate and polarised. Survivors of the Liberty attack and their families praised the article. Military historians debated its implications. Intelligence community veterans appeared on news programmes to denounce it as baseless speculation. The Pentagon declined to comment. Carter received death threats. He also received calls from 3 former NSA analysts who claimed they'd seen similar frequency anomalies in other classified operations from the Cold War era. None would go on record. 2 weeks after publication, Carter received a formal letter from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence requesting he turn over the original recording for authentication analysis. He declined through his lawyer, citing source protection. The story faded from the news cycle after a month. Some things are too old, too buried, too protected by institutional inertia to ever fully surface. But Carter kept digging. He found the patent Linda Baker had mentioned, US Patent 5159703. Method and apparatus for electromagnetic signature modulation. Filed in 1970, granted in 1992. The inventors, Richard Kellerman, Raytheon Advanced Systems, David Morse, DARPA Research Division, and Thomas Chen, Naval Research Laboratory. The patent described using extremely low-frequency electromagnetic pulses to create phase cancellation of radar return signals, making objects invisible to radar detection. Commercial application: stealth technology for military aircraft and naval vessels. The patent cited prior research from 1965 to 1967, but didn't name the project. Carter found academic papers from the 1980s and 90s discussing the Schumann resonance, that's 7.83 Hz frequency, and its potential military applications. Theoretical work on using Earth's natural electromagnetic field as a carrier signal for undetectable communications or radar manipulation. He found a 2003 Defense Advanced Research Projects agency request for proposals. Iron field stabilization, active phase defense systems for next-generation electronic warfare. The technology had never stopped developing. Whatever they tested on Liberty in 1967 had evolved into the cutting edge of modern military technology. The secret had been protected not just to avoid accountability for an attack, but to preserve a strategic advantage that was still relevant today. Arlington National Cemetery, November 2025. On a cold afternoon, 58 years after the attack, the US Navy unveiled a memorial plaque for the USS Liberty at Arlington National Cemetery. A small ceremony, attended by aging survivors, family members, and a handful of Navy officials. Linda Baker attended in a wheelchair, oxygen tank at her side. She watched as a Marine Honor Guard presented the colours, and a Navy chaplain offered prayers for the dead. When the ceremony ended, a man in civilian clothes approached her. Late 50s, grey suit, no identifying credentials. "Mrs. Baker? I'm with the Office of Naval Intelligence, thank you for attending." "Did you know them? The men who died?" "No, ma'am. Before my time, but I wanted to thank you personally." "For what?" "For your service. For your discretion over the years. For helping close an old file." Baker looked at him sharply. "I didn't close anything. The journalist's story is still out there." The man smiled. "Stories fade. Conspiracy theories multiply and discredit themselves. What matters is that the institutional memory remains consistent. Tragic accident, mistaken identity, fog of war. Some things are better left under the waterline where they belong. He handed her a business card, blank except for a phone number. If you ever need anything, Mrs. Baker, the Navy takes care of its own. He walked away before she could respond. That night, Baker sat in her living room, too tired to sleep. She thought about Mark Reynolds, whoever he was now, whatever had happened to him. She thought about the men who died on liberty. She thought about all the secrets she'd kept and all the years that had passed. Her computer chimed. Incoming email. The sender address was a random string of characters, no subject line. She opened it. The message contained only 2 lines of text and an audio file attachment. Echo phase reactivated. Frequency 7.83 Hz detected. Eastern Med Array. Baker's hand trembled as she clicked the attachment. A waveform appeared on her screen. Audio data, time-stamped from the earlier that day. She plugged in her headphones and pressed play. At first, nothing. White noise. The hiss of distant ocean monitoring equipment. Then, gradually emerging from the background, a low rhythmic pulse. Steady. Measured. Precisely 7.83 Hz. The same frequency she detected 58 years ago. The pulse continued for 30 seconds, growing slightly louder, more distinct, and beneath it so faint she had to turn the volume to maximum. Something else. Not random noise. Pattern. Structure. Multiple voices overlapped and distorted, speaking in fragments. Phase alignment confirmed. Target lock acquired. Maintain visual until... Cyan control. Baker's breath caught. These weren't recordings from 1967. The audio quality was too clean, too digital. This was new, current, happening right now. She checked the timestamp again. November 15th, 2025, 1413 UTC. The exact same time the Liberty attack had begun, 58 years earlier, 1413 local time in the Eastern Mediterranean. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Someone was running the system again, in the same location, at the same time, either as a test, a demonstration, or an actual operation. The audio file continued playing. The pulse grew stronger, more insistent, until it began to synchronize with something else. A deeper rhythm, slower, familiar. It took her a moment to recognize it. A heartbeat. Human heartbeat rhythm. Approximately 60 beats per minute. The electromagnetic pulse was modulating to match it, as if the technology itself had evolved to interface with biological rhythms, making it harder to distinguish from natural background noise. The sound built, layering upon itself, electromagnetic pulse, human heartbeat, those fragmented voices, all blending into a single resonant frequency that made Baker's chest feel tight, her own heart seeming to synchronize with the rhythm coming through her headphones. At exactly 60 seconds, the audio cut out. Silence. Baker sat frozen, headphones still on, staring at her computer screen. The email had already disappeared from her inbox. She checked her deleted folder, her spam folder. Nothing. As if it had never existed. But the audio file was still on her desktop, and she tried to open it again. The file was corrupted, 0 bytes, unreadable. Someone had sent her evidence of an active operation and then remotely erased it, leaving her with nothing but memory and the knowledge that after 58 years, Cyan Wave wasn't history. It was still operational, still secret, still being used somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean at this very moment. Baker closed her laptop and sat in the darkness of her living room. Outside, a cold November wind rattled the windows. The American flag on her porch snapped and rippled. She thought about those 34 sailors, about Mark Reynolds and his stolen tape, about Commander McGonagall standing on that bridge refusing to abandon his post, even as his ship was destroyed around him. She thought about all the secrets she'd kept, all the years of silence and whether any of it had mattered. Her phone sat on the table beside her. She could call Carter, tell him about the email, the audio, the active signal, but what would that accomplish? Another story that would be denied, debunked, dismissed. Or she could do nothing. Let it go. Die with her secrets intact. having spent her whole life in the shadows of classified operations. Baker picked up the phone. She dialed Carter's number. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Baker, are you okay? It's almost midnight." "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "they're running it again. Right now. Same location, same time. I just received proof." "Received from who?" "I don't know. Someone who wants me to know. Or wants to see what I'll do with the information." "Do you still have the proof?" "No. It erased itself, but I heard it, Evan. That frequency, those voices. It's not historical, it's active. Right now." Carter was silent for a moment. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to keep digging. Keep asking questions. Don't let them bury it for another 58 years. Those men deserve better. The truth deserves better. And you? What will you do?" Baker looked at the blank business card from the O&I officer, still sitting on her coffee table. "I'm going to make a phone call," she said. "I'm going to tell them I know. And then I'm going to sleep better than I have in 58 years. They might... I'm 94 years old and dying of cancer, Evan. What are they going to do? The only power they have over me is silence. And I'm done being silent." She hung up before he could argue. Baker sat for a long time, holding that blank business card, thinking about consequences and courage and the weight of truth. Finally, at 12:47 a.m, she dialed the number. It rang once. A voice answered. Male, neutral, professional. "Yes?" "This is Linda Baker. Someone wanted me to know that sine wave is still active. I'm calling to tell you that I know. I've always known. And now someone else knows too." Silence on the line then. "Mrs. Baker, I think you may be confused." "Perhaps." "I'm not confused. I was there from the beginning. I saw the frequency data. I kept the documents. And tonight I heard the same pulse, live, from the Eastern Mediterranean. You can deny it, classify it, bury it under 50 more years of secrecy, but you can't stop the truth from eventually surfacing." Another pause. When the voice returned, it was colder. "The truth, Mrs. Baker, is complicated. National security requires difficult decisions. Sometimes the greater good demands sacrifice. Tell that to the 34 men who died. Their sacrifice advanced American defensive capabilities that have protected thousands of lives since. Would you undo that?" "I would have found another way. One that didn't require killing our own sailors. There was no other way. And if you truly believed what you're saying, you would have gone public decades ago. But you didn't. Because you understand the necessity of secrets." Baker closed her eyes. He was right. She'd had 58 years to speak. She'd chosen silence. Until now. "You're right," she said softly. "I should have spoken sooner. But I can end my life having finally told the truth. Sine wave happened. It's still happening. And people deserve to know. No one will believe you without proof. And you have none. Maybe. But I'm not the only one who knows anymore. And eventually secrets always surface. Good night, Mrs. Baker. Thank you for your service." The line went dead. Baker set down the phone and exhaled slowly. Her heart was racing. She felt more alive than she had in years. She'd done it. Finally, after all this time, she'd confronted the people who'd buried the truth for 6 decades. Outside, a car started somewhere on her street. Engine noise, headlights briefly washing across her windows, then darkness again. If they were watching, let them watch. She'd said what needed to be said. Baker went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in 58 years. Epilogue. 6 months later, May 2026. Linda Baker died peacefully in her sleep on May 3rd, 2026, at the age of 94. Her obituary in the Washington Post mentioned her distinguished career at the National Security Agency and her contributions to signals intelligence during the Cold War. It did not mention USS Liberty or Sine Wave. Evan Carter attended her funeral in Arlington. A military honor guard was present. Several elderly former NSA colleagues paid their respects. The ONI officer in the grey suit stood in the back, watching. After the service, Carter found a manila envelope on his car windshield, secured under the wiper blade. Inside, a USB drive and a handwritten note in Linda Baker's shaky script, dated 2 weeks before her death. Mr. Carter, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Enclosed is everything I kept over the years. Documents, audio files, analysis. Use your judgment. Some truths are worth the cost, some aren't. You'll have to decide. But decide honestly. Don't let fear make the choice for you. Those sailors died for a secret. Make sure their deaths meant something. LB. Carter plugged the USB drive into his laptop that night. Hundreds of files. Scanned documents from the 1960s and 70s. Audio recordings. Technical analyses. Linda Baker's complete archive of everything she'd learned about Operation Cyan Wave. At the bottom of the directory, one video file for Evan.mp4. He clicked it. Linda Baker appeared on screen, sitting in her living room, clearly unwell but sharp-eyed. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 3 days before her death. "Hello, Evan," she said. "If you're watching this, I kept my promise to myself. I died, having told the truth. Everything on this drive is real. Cyan Wave existed. It was tested on Liberty. 34 men died to protect it, and it's still being used today. You have a choice now. Publish this and face the consequences, or put it away and let the secret stay buried. I can't tell you what to do. But I can tell you this. Those sailors didn't have a choice. They were sacrificed by people who saw them as expendable. The least we owe them is the truth. Whatever you decide, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for giving an old woman the courage to finally do the right thing." She smiled sadly. "Good luck, Evan. The truth is a heavy burden, but it's the only thing worth carrying." The video ended. Carter sat in silence, the weight of decision pressing down on him. Outside, Washington, D.C. hummed with the machinery of government, agencies and institutions and classified programs operating in shadows, protecting secrets that might be vital or might be criminal. He thought about Linda Baker, about Mark Reynolds, about Commander McGonagall and 34 sailors who died in the Mediterranean. He thought about truth and consequences, about secrecy and accountability. Then he opened a new document and began to write. The title appeared, Operation Cyan Wave, The Complete Story. Whether he would publish it, whether the world would ever read it, whether the truth would be more than fragments and implications, that remained uncertain. But at least now someone knew. Someone had listened. Someone was carrying the burden forward, and somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, at precisely 14:13 local time, a low-frequency pulse cycled through the electromagnetic spectrum at 7.83 Hz, detected by satellites and monitoring stations, part of a system that had never stopped evolving, never stopped operating, never stopped echoing across the decades since that June afternoon in 1967. The sound built, layered with meaning and memory. It matched a human heartbeat. It faded into silence, and the world moved on, carrying its secrets, waiting for the day when truth would surface, not as conspiracy but as history, when those 34 sailors would receive something more than a memorial plaque, waiting for the echoes to finally be heard. Flight 370, the plane that vanished. Imagine boarding a plane for a routine overnight flight. You settle into your seat, close your eyes, and drift off as the engines hum beneath you. 6 hours later, you should wake up in Beijing. Instead, you wake up nowhere. You're simply gone, erased from the sky. No wreckage, no answers, no closure. This is not a thought experiment. This happened to 239 people on March 8th, 2014. And 10 years later, we still do not know why. The night everything changed. The air in Kuala Lumpur International Airport hung thick and humid on that March evening. Passengers filtered through the gate for Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, a red-eye service to Beijing Capital International Airport. Most were Chinese nationals heading home. Others were international travellers connecting through Beijing to destinations beyond. The Boeing 777 that would carry them sat gleaming under the airport lights, registration number 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. Nearly £400,000 of aircraft, fuel, cargo and human life. Among the passengers was Philip Wood, an American executive working for IBM in Beijing. He had texted his partner before boarding, talking about plans for the summer, about maybe finally taking that vacation to Thailand they had been discussing. There was Wang Linshi, a 50-year-old calligraphy artist returning from an exhibition in Kuala Lumpur. His daughter was pregnant with his first grandchild. He carried a small carved wooden box in his carry-on, a gift he had spent weeks searching for. There were 23 employees of Freescale Semiconductor, engineers and technicians heading home after a week of technical training. They joked about the late departure time as they boarded, making plans to sleep through the flight. None of them knew they had approximately 1 hour and 38 minutes left to exist in the known world. At 12:41 in the morning local time, the wheels lifted off Malaysian soil. Captain Zahare Ahmad Shah, 53 years old with 18,000 hours of flight experience, commanded the aircraft. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27, sat beside him. Everything proceeded normally. The plane climbed into the darkness, turning northeast toward the South China Sea. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers reclined their seats. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering blankets and confirming seat belts. The cockpit was quiet. Routine. The autopilot system had already taken over the majority of flying tasks. The aircraft knew where it needed to go. All the pilots had to do was monitor, supervise and wait for Beijing to appear on the horizon in 5.5 hours. Air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur handed the flight off to Vietnamese airspace. At 1:19 in the morning, a voice from the cockpit transmitted the standard acknowledgement. Good night, Malaysian 37. 0. Routine words. Calm. Professional. Nothing to suggest what would happen next. 2 minutes later, at 1:21, the aircraft's transponder went silent. A transponder is not a luxury item. It is the voice that tells the world where you are, who you are, and how high you are flying. When it stops transmitting, the aircraft becomes a ghost. Controllers in Vietnam waited for Flight 370 to appear on their screens. It never did. They called Malaysian Air Traffic Control. Has the flight left your airspace? Yes, came the reply. It should be with you now. But it was not with anyone. For several minutes, controllers assumed it was a technical glitch. Transponders fail. Radios malfunction. It happens. They waited for the blip to reappear, for the pilots to call in with a problem report, for something normal to explain the absence. The minutes stretched. The silence deepened. And somewhere over the dark waters of the South China Sea, 239 people continued flying into oblivion. The turn. What happened next would become the foundation for every theory, every sleepless night, every conspiracy that followed. At 1:21, the moment the transponder died, the aircraft did not fall from the sky. It did not explode. It did not vanish into the ocean. Instead, it turned. A deliberate, calculated turn. Not the panicked manoeuvre of a pilot fighting for control, but the smooth banking arc of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The turn was precise. It occurred at the exact moment when responsibility for the aircraft was transferring between Malaysian and Vietnamese air traffic control. In that brief window, when neither controller was actively watching, the plane pivoted. It was the kind of timing that suggests either meticulous planning or extraordinary coincidence, and coincidences of that magnitude do not happen often in aviation. Military radar, which does not rely on transponders, tracked the aircraft as it reversed course. It flew back across the Malay Peninsula, threading through the border between Malaysian and Thai airspace. This corridor, the boundary between two countries, is monitored by both nations but actively controlled by neither. It is a seam in the radar coverage, a gap where an aircraft can fly without triggering immediate alerts. The plane followed this seam as though following a map. It passed directly over Malaysia at cruising altitude, over towns and cities where people slept, over the capital where government buildings sat dark and empty. No fighter jets scrambled to intercept, no alarm systems triggered. The aircraft was invisible to civilian radar and ignored by military systems that assumed it was an authorised flight. By 2:22 in the morning, it had travelled hundreds of miles in the wrong direction, heading northwest toward the Andaman Sea, and it was still flying. This was not a malfunction. This was a plan. The aircraft continued on this northwestern heading for approximately another hour. It flew over the Andaman Sea, that vast stretch of water between Thailand and India. Ships below saw nothing. Fishermen pulling nets in the darkness had no idea a commercial airliner was passing overhead. The plane was alone, cut off from communication, invisible to tracking systems, moving with purpose toward a destination no one could identify. Then, somewhere over the ocean, it turned again. This time, south. A long, sweeping arc that would take it away from all commercial flight paths, away from land, away from any place where people might notice. The Indian Ocean stretched before it, millions of square kilometres of empty water, and the aircraft pointed itself toward the void. At 8:11 that morning, nearly 7 hours after takeoff, a satellite owned by the British telecommunications company in Muscat registered a final automatic handshake with the aircraft. The plane's communication system, even with the transponder disabled, continued sending hourly pings to the satellite network. These pings did not contain location data, but engineers could analyse the signal to estimate distance and direction. The mathematics pointed to one conclusion. The aircraft had flown south, deep into the Indian Ocean, far beyond any possible landing site. Then silence, absolute and final. The search for ghosts. When dawn broke over the South China Sea on March 8th, families waiting at Beijing Airport knew something had gone wrong. Flight 370 had not arrived. It had not diverted. It had simply failed to exist. The arrival board showed the flight as delayed, then cancelled, then removed entirely. Airline representatives appeared, their faces carefully neutral, and began escorting family members to private rooms. They offered water, tissues, and apologies for the lack of information. They could not say where the plane was because they did not know. Vietnamese search and rescue teams scrambled aircraft and ships to scour the waters between Malaysia and Vietnam. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no emergency beacons. The ocean surface remained pristine, as though the plane had never been there. They expanded the search area, thinking perhaps the aircraft had deviated slightly from its flight plan. They checked islands, coastlines, shallow waters where wreckage might be visible from the air. Nothing. For days, the search focused on the wrong ocean. Authorities assumed the aircraft had gone down somewhere near its intended flight path. It was a reasonable assumption. Planes do not turn around and fly backward. They do not disable their communication systems and navigate using military radar gaps. Ships crisscrossed the South China Sea. Aircraft flew grid patterns until their fuel tanks ran dry. International teams from China, Australia, Malaysia, and the United States poured resources into the effort. They were searching for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was the size of a small country and the needle was made of aluminum that sinks. The media descended. Reporters from every major news organisation converged on Kuala Lumpur and Beijing. They interviewed aviation experts, radar specialists and former pilots. Everyone had theories. Some suggested mechanical failure. Others pointed to terrorism. A few mentioned hijacking. But without wreckage, without bodies, without any physical evidence, every explanation was speculation dressed up as analysis. On March 24th, Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak held a press conference. His face carried the weight of impossible news. Based on satellite analysis, he announced, Flight 370 had ended its journey in the southern Indian Ocean west of Perth, Australia. There were no survivors. The plane had flown for hours in the opposite direction of its destination before running out of fuel and plunging into one of the most remote stretches of water on Earth. The families in Beijing erupted. Some collapsed. Others screamed. A few attacked the airline representatives, demanding proof, demanding explanations, demanding that someone tell them how a plane could simply disappear in the age of satellites and GPS and global connectivity. The Malaysian government offered condolences. They promised a full investigation. They assured everyone that the truth would be found. But the truth was already drowning in miles of seawater, and no one knew where to look. The search shifted. Australian authorities coordinated the largest maritime search operation in history. Ships equipped with sophisticated sonar systems dragged towfish across the ocean floor, scanning an area that eventually exceeded 120,000 square kilometres. The technology was impressive. Side-scan sonar that could image the ocean bottom in stunning detail. Autonomous underwater vehicles that could dive deeper than any human and stay down for days. Magnetometers that detected metal from miles away. They mapped underwater mountains, discovered new marine species, and found shipwrecks that had been lost for centuries. But they did not find Flight 370. The search vessels operated in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The Indian Ocean is not gentle. Waves reached heights that dwarfed the ships. Storms rolled through with violence that shut down operations for days at a time. Crew members lived in cramped quarters, staring at sonar screens for hours, watching the ocean floor scroll past in grainy monochrome. Every anomaly triggered excitement. Every rock formation that looked slightly out of place became a potential lead. They would mark the coordinates, send down an underwater vehicle to investigate, and find nothing but geology and marine life. The operation cost more than $160 million. It involved multiple nations, dozens of ships, and thousands of personnel. It continued for nearly 3 years. In January of 2017, the search was officially suspended. The families of the missing were left with condolences and questions. The ocean had swallowed an entire aircraft, and it was not giving it back. Fragments of proof. Then the ocean began to speak, one piece at a time. In July of 2015, Johnny Baig, a municipal worker on Reunion Island, was cleaning a beach on the eastern shore. It was routine work. Trash washed ashore constantly. Plastic bottles, fishing nets, debris from ships passing through the Indian Ocean shipping lanes. But this piece was different. It was large, maybe 6 feet long, covered in barnacles and algae. The metal underneath showed through in places, along with what looked like identifying numbers. Begay called the authorities. Within hours, aviation experts arrived. They photographed the object from every angle. They documented the barnacle growth, the corrosion patterns, the way the metal had torn. Then they loaded it onto a plane and flew it to France, where specialists at a facility outside Toulouse would examine it in a climate-controlled laboratory. It was a flaperon, part of the wing structure used to control the aircraft during landing. The serial numbers matched. It came from 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. It came from Flight 370. The discovery changed everything. It proved the aircraft had not been hidden on some remote island or secret military base. It had crashed. It had broken apart. And the currents of the Indian Ocean had been slowly distributing the wreckage for over a year. But the flaperon also raised questions. It showed evidence of high-speed impact, but not catastrophic destruction. The way it had separated from the wing suggested the aircraft had hit the water hard, but perhaps not as violently as a straight nosedive would produce. Some experts argued this indicated a controlled ditching attempt. Others said it proved nothing beyond the fact that the plane had crashed. Over the following months, more fragments appeared. A piece of wing washed ashore in Mozambique in February of 2016. Interior panelling from the cabin turned up on Madagascar a month later. a section of engine cowling arrived on the coast of Tanzania. Each fragment carried the signature marks of the missing Boeing 777. The Indian Ocean had been slowly digesting the wreckage for years, and now it was offering proof that the aircraft had indeed met its end in those waters. Beachcombers became amateur investigators. People walking coastlines across the western Indian Ocean began looking for debris. They found fragments of composite material, pieces of what might have been seat components, scraps of metal that could have come from anywhere. The Malaysian government established protocols for reporting finds. Each piece was documented, photographed and analysed. Some were confirmed as coming from Flight 370. Others were from different aircraft, different accidents, different tragedies that the ocean had also claimed, but the fragments raised as many questions as they answered. Why only small pieces? Where was the main wreckage? Where were the flight data recorders, the black boxes that could explain everything? The pieces that had washed ashore represented less than 1% of the aircraft's total mass. A 777 weighs over 300,000 pounds empty. What had been recovered could fit in a cargo van. The rest remained hidden somewhere beneath miles of water. Ocean current experts studied the drift patterns. They built computer models simulating how debris would move through the Indian Ocean. They factored in wind, surface currents, deep ocean circulation patterns, and the Coriolis effect. The model suggested that if debris had appeared on Reunion Island in July of 2015, the crash site must be farther north than east than the official search area. The plane might have come down closer to Madagascar, not off the coast of Australia. If true, the entire 3-year search had been conducted in the wrong ocean. The ships had dragged their sonar arrays over the wrong sea floor. The underwater vehicles had photographed the wrong underwater mountains, and Flight 370 remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and undiscovered. The official conclusion: in July of 2018, the Malaysian government released its final report on the disappearance. The document ran to hundreds of pages. It contained radar data, satellite analysis, maintenance records, and biographical profiles of the crew. It examined the cargo manifest, passenger lists, and airport security footage. It included testimony from air traffic controllers, statements from family members, and technical assessments from aviation engineers. The conclusions were careful, measured, and ultimately unsatisfying. The aircraft had been manually diverted from its flight path by a person or persons unknown in the cockpit. The communication systems had been deliberately disabled. The transponder did not fail. Someone turned it off. The OCAR system, which transmits engine performance data, was also disabled. Someone went through the cockpit overhead panel and systematically shut down every system that would allow the outside world to track the aircraft. This required knowledge, access, and time. It was not the action of hijackers forcing their way into the cockpit. It was the methodical work of someone who belonged there. The plane had flown on for hours under human control before fuel exhaustion caused it to descend into the ocean. The final satellite handshake suggested the aircraft was in a rapid descent, possibly unpowered. Whether this descent was controlled or resulted from the aircraft simply falling out of the sky after running out of fuel could not be determined. Then came the admission that stripped away any sense of closure. The team is unable to determine the real cause for the disappearance, the report stated. We cannot exclude the possibility that there was unlawful interference by a third party. In other words, after 4 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the largest search in aviation history, the official answer was this: we do not know. Someone did something, and we cannot tell you who or why. It was an invitation for speculation, an open door through which every conspiracy theory, every alternative explanation, and every buried suspicion could walk. The captain and the flight simulator. Zahari Ahmad Shah had been flying for Malaysian Airlines since 1981. He was not a rookie. He was not erratic. Colleagues described him as professional, calm, and deeply knowledgeable. He had logged 18,000 flight hours, the kind of experience that turns piloting into muscle memory. He was a father, a husband, and an aviation enthusiast who built a full flight simulator in his home. The simulator was not a toy. It was a sophisticated setup using commercial software and professional-grade controls. He used it to practice approaches to difficult airports, to explore scenery, and to refine his skills. After the disappearance, Malaysian investigators seized the simulator. Forensic analysts recovered deleted files from the hard drive. What they found sent a chill through the investigation. Among the saved flight plans was a route that flew south into the Indian Ocean, continuing until fuel exhaustion. The flight path matched almost exactly the satellite data showing where the real aircraft had gone. The simulator data showed coordinates that aligned with the presumed crash site. The flight profile showed an aircraft flying for hours far beyond any normal route, until the fuel gauges read 0. It was as though someone had been planning, testing, rehearsing for the exact scenario that unfolded on March 8th. Had Zahari rehearsed his own suicide mission? The evidence seemed damning. He had the skill to disable every communication system on the aircraft. He had the knowledge to exploit radar gaps and international airspace boundaries. He knew the exact moment to turn off the transponder, the precise corridor to fly through to avoid detection, and the fuel calculations needed to reach the most remote part of the Indian Ocean. If anyone could make a 777 vanish, it was him. Investigators dug deeper into his personal life. They interviewed friends, family members and colleagues. They examined his financial records, his political affiliations and his social media activity. They found a man who seemed, by all accounts, content. His marriage had its problems, but what marriage does not after decades? His finances were stable. He was respected at work and liked by those who knew him. He had no terminal illness, no crushing debt, no scandal that would drive someone to desperate action. Some pointed to his support for Malaysian opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, who had been convicted of sodomy charges just hours before the flight departed. Zahari had attended political rallies. He had posted on social media about government corruption and judicial overreach. Could he have been so enraged by the verdict that he decided to make a political statement written in jet fuel and ocean water? The theory felt strained. Even if he opposed the government, why kill hundreds of innocent people? Why leave no message explaining his actions? Political protesters want attention. They want their grievances heard. A protest without a statement is not a protest. It is simply murder. And mass murder without explanation is the action of someone who has abandoned all connection to the human community. But there was another interpretation of the simulator data. Pilots run unusual scenarios all the time. They practice emergency procedures. They explore what-if situations. What if all engines failed over the ocean? What if communication systems went dead? What if you had to ditch in water? Running these scenarios in a simulator is precisely what a conscientious, skilled pilot would do. It is preparation, not planning. And the fact that one scenario happened to match the actual flight path could be coincidence. Or it could be proof. The investigation could not decide. They presented the evidence and left the conclusion ambiguous. Zahari remained Schrödinger's pilot, simultaneously innocent and guilty until someone opened the black box that would collapse the uncertainty into fact. But the black box was somewhere on the ocean floor and no one could find it. The ghost in the machine. The Boeing 777 is not just an aircraft. It is a flying computer network. Every system, from navigation to engine performance, feeds data through digital channels. The plane talks to the ground, to satellites, to its own internal components. It is monitored, measured, and managed by software. Hundreds of computers coordinate to keep the aircraft in the air, and where there are computers, there are vulnerabilities. In the years following 9/11, engineers developed concepts for remote flight recovery systems. The idea was simple and compelling. If hijackers took control of an aircraft, a signal from the ground could override the cockpit and fly the plane to safety. Passengers and crew would be protected. Hijackers would be neutralized. Terrorism in the sky would become impossible. Boeing filed patents for such technology. The concepts included encrypted communication links, that could take control of flight systems, override manual inputs from the cockpit, and land the aircraft at a predetermined safe location. Honeywell explored similar systems. The goal was noble, but the implications were terrifying. If you can override a hijacker, you can override anyone. If you can remotely control a plane for good, you can remotely control it for anything. Conspiracy theorists latched onto this. What if Flight 370 was not diverted by the pilots, but by someone else? What if a cyber intrusion, a military override, or a classified program took control of the aircraft and flew it to a location the public was never meant to discover? The sudden loss of the transponder, the deliberate course change, the hours of silent flight through radar gaps all fit the profile of external interference. Think about the sequence of events. At 1:21 in the morning, multiple systems went dark simultaneously. The transponder stopped transmitting. The ACARS data link cut off. The radio went silent. For all of these systems to fail at once would require either catastrophic damage to the aircraft or deliberate action by someone with intimate knowledge of the plane's architecture. But there was no evidence of catastrophic damage. The plane kept flying. If someone in the cockpit was responsible, they would have needed to know exactly which circuit breakers to pull, which switches to flip, and which systems to disable in what order. They would have needed to do this while maintaining control of the aircraft, avoiding detection, and navigating through some of the most monitored airspace in the world. It is possible. Pilots train for emergencies that require quickly disabling systems, but the precision and timing suggest something more than emergency response. It suggests planning. But what if the actions came from outside the cockpit? What if someone accessed the aircraft's systems remotely and took control? The Boeing 777 does have data links that allow ground personnel to communicate with the aircraft's computers. These links are used for routine maintenance monitoring and software updates. They are encrypted and secured, but encryption can be broken and security can be bypassed. In the years since Flight 370 disappeared, security researchers have demonstrated vulnerabilities in aviation systems. They have shown how spoofing GPS signals can confuse navigation systems. They have hacked into in-flight entertainment networks and accessed deeper aircraft systems. They have proven that the digital architecture of modern aircraft, while sophisticated, is not impenetrable. The region through which Flight 370 flew is not empty airspace. It includes military zones monitored by multiple nations. Thailand operates radar installations that track everything moving through their airspace. India has air defence networks covering the Andaman Sea. The United States maintains signals intelligence facilities throughout the region. If the aircraft was hijacked remotely, those governments would have known. Their systems would have detected unusual communications, anomalous radar tracks or electronic signatures indicating a cyber operation. And if they knew, their silence becomes part of the cover-up. It transforms the disappearance from a tragedy into an act of war, or espionage, or some classified operation that cannot be acknowledged without exposing capabilities the public is not meant to know exist. But there is a problem. No evidence exists that remote override technology was ever installed on 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. The systems were theoretical, not operational. Boeing and Malaysian Airlines both confirmed that the aircraft lacked any such capability. Hacking into a plane mid-flight would require exploiting vulnerabilities that had never been demonstrated in a real-world scenario outside of controlled research environments. It is possible in the way that many things are technically possible, but that does not make it probable. Still, the theory persists because it answers the unanswerable. If human error or pilot suicide seems too simple, and if mechanical failure does not fit the facts, then external interference becomes the explanation that fills the void. It transforms a tragedy into a crime, and crimes have perpetrators. Crimes can be solved. Someone can be held accountable. The alternative, that chaos simply reached up and snatched 239 people out of existence, offers no one to blame and no path to justice. The island, no one admits exists. There is a place in the Indian Ocean that does not appear on most commercial maps. Diego Garcia. a coral atoll in the Chagos archipelago, leased by the British to the United States military. It hosts one of the most secretive and strategically important military installations on the planet. Long-range bombers operate from its runways. Nuclear submarines resupply at its docks. Intelligence operations launch from its secure facilities. Detainees captured in the War on Terror have been held there, far from lawyers and oversight, and it lies within fuel range of the last known position of Flight 370. The atoll is small, barely visible on most maps, but its strategic value is enormous. Diego Garcia sits at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean, positioned perfectly to project military power across Africa, the Middle East and South Asia. The base is so sensitive that even acknowledging operations there requires security clearances most military personnel will never obtain. What happens on Diego Garcia stays on Diego Garcia. Online researchers began connecting dots almost immediately after the disappearance. What if the aircraft did not crash? What if it was intercepted after entering restricted airspace and forced to land at Diego Garcia? The theory gained traction for several reasons. First, a controlled landing would explain the lack of debris in the initial search area. If the plane landed intact, there would be no wreckage floating in the South China Sea. The weeks of fruitless searching would make perfect sense. They were looking for something that had never crashed. Second, the US military had the capability to track and intercept an aircraft operating in that region. Diego Garcia has radar coverage extending for hundreds of miles. They would have seen Flight 370 coming. They would have known it was off course, unresponsive to radio calls, and heading toward restricted airspace. Standard protocols would require an intercept. Fighter jets would have been scrambled. The aircraft would have been visually identified, and if it entered the exclusion zone around Diego Garcia without authorization, the military would have options ranging from forced landing to shooting it down. Third, the base's extreme secrecy meant that any operation conducted there would remain hidden from public view. If the aircraft landed on Diego Garcia, the passengers could be detained indefinitely. The plane could be hidden in a hangar or dismantled, evidence could be controlled, and the official story could be whatever the governments involved decided it should be. Supporters of the theory pointed to anomalies. Some claim that satellite imagery from the night of the disappearance showed unusual activity at Diego Garcia. Commercial satellites do not typically photograph military bases, but some amateur satellite trackers reported that imaging satellites passed over the atoll around the time Flight 370 would have been in the area. The images were not released publicly, which conspiracy theorists took as confirmation that something was being hidden. Others noted that several passengers aboard the flight had connections to technology or defence industries. The Freescale semiconductor employees, for instance, worked on cutting-edge chip designs used in military applications. What if one of them was carrying sensitive information? What if the entire aircraft was intercepted to prevent that information from reaching China? It would be an extreme measure, but for information valuable enough, extreme measures might be justified. The theory gained further traction when a passenger aboard the flight, Philip Wood, allegedly sent a text message and photo after the plane disappeared. The metadata from the photo, according to claims circulating online, showed GPS coordinates placing it at Diego Garcia. The image itself was black, as though taken from inside a dark room or while the phone was concealed. The accompanying message claimed he had been drugged, was being held captive, and did not know where he was. Tech experts quickly debunked the claim. The metadata was fabricated. The message was a hoax. But the story spread faster than the debunking, and for many it became evidence of a cover-up, but the theory requires a conspiracy so vast it strains credibility. It would mean the United States, Malaysia, Australia, China and multiple other governments coordinated a cover-up involving thousands of personnel. Air traffic controllers, radar operators, satellite analysts, search and rescue teams, investigators and journalists would all need to be complicit or deceived. It would mean families grieving for their loved ones were lied to for years. It would mean wreckage was planted on beaches across the Indian Ocean to support a false narrative. And for what? to hide the capture of one aircraft, to conceal the detention of 239 people who would never be allowed to, contact the outside world again, to protect information that could have been seized on the ground before the plane ever took off. The operational complexity and political risk of such a scheme far outweigh any conceivable benefit. The United States denied any involvement. The Malaysian government found no evidence supporting the theory. No whistleblowers emerged. No satellite photos confirmed the claims. Diego Garcia's logs, according to official statements, showed no record of Flight 370 ever approaching the base. And yet the theory endures because Diego Garcia represents the ultimate black box, a place where secrets go to hide, a location where the impossible becomes plausible simply because no one can prove otherwise. The cargo that should not have been there. Every flight carries baggage, freight and cargo that passengers never see. Flight 370 was no exception. The manifest listed 221 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries and 2.5 tons of electronics equipment shipped by Motorola. On the surface, this seems routine. Airlines transport batteries and electronics constantly. But the details raised questions. Lithium batteries are dangerous. They store energy in a volatile chemical form that can ignite under the right conditions. Overheating, physical damage, or manufacturing defects can trigger thermal runaway, a chain reaction where the battery heats itself to combustion. Once a lithium fire starts, it is nearly impossible to extinguish. Water does not work. Conventional fire extinguishers are ineffective. The fire burns until the chemical fuel is exhausted, releasing toxic gases and intense heat. Aviation regulators impose strict limits on how lithium batteries are packaged and transported. They must be individually protected, stored in fireproof containers, and limited in quantity per shipment. If the batteries on Flight 370 were improperly packed, they could have started a fire in the cargo hold. A fire could explain the sudden communication failures. Smoke and heat would incapacitate the crew. The aircraft on autopilot would continue flying until the fire consumed critical systems or the fuel ran out. Several fatal crashes have been caused by cargo fires. In 2010, UPS Airlines Flight 6 crashed in Dubai after a fire in the cargo hold filled the cockpit with smoke. The crew declared an emergency, but by the time they attempted to land, both pilots were incapacitated. The aircraft crashed short of the runway. Investigation revealed that lithium batteries in the cargo had ignited. Could the same thing have happened to Flight 370? The timeline seems to fit. The transponder went dark at 1:21. A fire could have been burning for several minutes before that, filling the cargo hold with smoke. The crew might have noticed warnings, declared an emergency to air traffic control, and then been cut off as the fire destroyed communication systems. The turn back toward Malaysia would make sense. They were trying to return to Kuala Lumpur for an emergency landing, but this theory has a fatal flaw. The satellite data proves the aircraft flew for nearly 7 hours after the transponder went dark. A cargo fire severe enough to disable communications would have destroyed the plane within minutes, not hours. The fire would have burned through control cables, hydraulic lines, and structural components. The aircraft would have become uncontrollable and crashed in the South China Sea, not the Indian Ocean. And the deliberate course change, the precise navigation through radar gaps, suggests human intent, not a crew desperately fighting a fire. Other researchers focused on the nature of the cargo itself. What was Motorola shipping? The manifest listed the items as electronics, but provided no specifics. Customs documents showed weights that did not quite match the manifest. Some components were listed as radio equipment. Others were described as accessories. The vagueness invited speculation. Some theorized that the cargo included sensitive technology or intelligence materials being transported to China. Semiconductor components, encrypted communications devices, prototypes of military hardware. If true, could a foreign power have intercepted the aircraft to seize the cargo? Could the plane have been shot down to prevent the technology from reaching its destination? These theories collapse under scrutiny. Shooting down a civilian airliner to stop a shipment of electronics is not how intelligence agencies operate. It is too public, too messy, and too risky. If a government wanted to intercept cargo, they would do it on the ground, at the airport, before the plane ever took off. Customs inspections, security screenings, and freight audits provide ample opportunity to examine cargo without resorting to aircraft interception. And even if someone did shoot down Flight 370, the debris would have been found. A missile strike leaves evidence. Wreckage does not fly 7 hours south and then gently scatter itself across the Indian Ocean. Missile fragments would be embedded in the debris. Chemical residues from the warhead would be detectable. Radar systems across multiple countries would have tracked the missile launch and impact. The cargo conspiracy persists because the manifest documents remain incomplete. Conflicting reports about weights and contents fuel suspicion. When governments cannot provide clear answers about what was on the plane, people assume they're hiding something, and perhaps they are. But the secret is more likely bureaucratic incompetence than international intrigue. Shipping manifests are often incomplete, especially for complex electronics. Customs forms are filled out by freight handlers who may not understand the technical specifications of what they are loading. Errors happen, discrepancies appear, and in the absence of malice never attribute to conspiracy what can be explained by ordinary human carelessness. The shadow plane. 4 months after Flight 370 disappeared, another Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 met a violent end. On July 17th, 2014, Flight 17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a surface-to-air missile fired from territory controlled by Russian-backed separatists. 298 people died. The aircraft disintegrated at cruising altitude, scattering wreckage across fields and villages in the war zone. Bodies fell from the sky. Debris rained down over an area covering several square kilometres. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Same airline, same aircraft type, similar flight numbers, both disasters occurring within months of each other. For conspiracy theorists, the coincidence was too perfect. They proposed something breathtaking in its audacity. What if Flight 370 never crashed? What if it was secretly moved, repainted with the registration number of Flight 17, and deliberately destroyed over Ukraine to escalate geopolitical tensions with Russia? The theory goes like this. Flight 370 was taken, either by interception or by pilot action, and flown to a secret location. The passengers were disposed of, the exact method left to imagination. The aircraft was stored in a hangar, repainted, and fitted with the registration number and markings of Flight 17. On July 17th, this substitute aircraft, already filled with corpses to match the passenger manifest, was flown into Ukrainian airspace along the route that Flight 17 should have taken. It was shot down by the missile, providing the West with evidence to blame Russia for killing civilians and justifying sanctions and military escalation. The motive, they argued, was to frame Russia for downing a civilian airliner, strengthening Western support for sanctions and military aid to Ukraine. The conflict had been simmering for months. Pro-Russian separatists controlled parts of eastern Ukraine. The West supported the Ukrainian government. A civilian massacre would shift public opinion, justify intervention, and provide a casus belli for deeper involvement. The theory captivated corners of the internet because it explained two mysteries with one conspiracy. It accounted for the lack of wreckage from Flight 370 and provided a false flag explanation for the downing of Flight 17. It transformed random tragedies into calculated acts of statecraft. It gave meaning to the senseless and imposed narrative order on chaos. But the theory collapses the moment you examine the evidence. Investigators recovered wreckage from Flight 17. They documented serial numbers on engines, structural components, and cockpit fragments. They traced manufacturer plates back to Boeing production records. Every piece confirmed the aircraft was indeed the plane that departed Amsterdam on July 17th. carrying 298 passengers and crew, not a substitute flown in from a hangar somewhere. The wreckage analysis was exhaustive. Independent investigators from the Netherlands, Australia, Belgium, Malaysia and Ukraine participated. They recovered the cockpit, pieced together the fuselage sections, and examined the damage patterns. The aircraft showed evidence of high-energy fragmentation, consistent with proximity detonation of a surface-to-air missile warhead. Shrapnel had penetrated the airframe from outside. The damage was not staged, it was real. Moreover, the two aircraft had different maintenance histories, different configurations, and different equipment installed. Flight 370 was an older aircraft delivered in 2002. Flight 17 was newer, delivered in 1997. They had different interior layouts, different in-flight entertainment systems, different wear patterns from years of service. Swapping them would require replacing every component that carried identifying information. It would mean fooling airline staff who had worked on both planes, airport personnel who had serviced them, investigators from multiple nations who examined the wreckage, and the families of passengers who boarded Flight 17 in Amsterdam and could identify their loved ones from the remains recovered. The logistics alone make the theory impossible. You cannot secretly move a 777 without dozens of people noticing. Aircraft require maintenance crews, fuel trucks, tow vehicles and flight plans. They leave paper trails, hangar records, surveillance footage, radio communications. Every step of moving an aircraft from one location to another generates documentation, and every person involved in such an operation becomes a potential whistleblower. And yet the theory persists because the human mind seeks patterns, even in chaos. Two Malaysian Airlines 777s meeting disaster within 4 months feels like it cannot be coincidence. The timing seems too perfect, the similarities too pronounced. But coincidences happen. Probability does not care about narrative symmetry. Sometimes the universe is just cruel. Sometimes tragedies cluster for no reason other than random chance and the sheer number of flights operating every day. The mathematics of silence in Marsat, the British satellite company, became an unlikely protagonist in the search for Flight 370. Their satellites provided the only real-time data showing where the aircraft had gone after disappearing from radar. The system was never designed for tracking planes. It was meant to handle routine communications between aircraft and ground stations, email services, internet connectivity, phone calls from passengers willing to pay premium rates. But engineers realised they could extract information from the signal itself. Every hour, the aircraft's communication system sent an automatic handshake to the satellite, a digital ping confirming the connection was active. Think of it as a heartbeat, the system checking in to say I'm still here. These pings did not contain GPS data. It did not include altitude, heading, or speed. They were simply electronic acknowledgements that the link between aircraft and satellite remained intact. But buried in these pings was information. Two crucial pieces of data that, combined, could reveal where the aircraft had been. First, the time it took for the signal to travel from the plane to the satellite revealed distance. Radio waves travel at the speed of the light, a constant. Measure the round-trip time of the signal, and you can calculate how far the aircraft was from the satellite. This gave engineers a circle. Somewhere on this circle, at this specific distance from the satellite, was Flight 370. Second, the frequency shift caused by the plane's movement revealed direction. This is the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that makes a siren sound different as it approaches or recedes. If the aircraft was moving toward the satellite, the radio signal would be compressed, increasing in frequency. If moving away, the signal would be stretched, decreasing in frequency. Measure this shift precisely enough and you can determine whether the aircraft was moving north or south along that circle. Analysts fed this data into computer models. They calculated possible flight paths. They cross-referenced fuel consumption rates, aircraft performance specifications, and wind patterns recorded on the night of the disappearance. They accounted for the weight of the aircraft, the efficiency of the engines at different altitudes, and the atmospheric conditions along various routes. The mathematics pointed south. The aircraft had flown into the Indian Ocean, beyond any hope of landing, until the fuel tanks ran dry and the engines flamed out. The final ping at 8:11 in the morning marked the moment the plane lost power. The satellite received a partial handshake and incomplete communication that suggested the aircraft's electrical systems were failing. This could mean the engines had stopped. Without engines, the generators that power the aircraft's systems would shut down. The plane would lose electrical power, communication systems would die, and the aircraft would begin its final descent. But here is where the physics became uncertain. How did the plane descend? If the pilots were unconscious or dead from hypoxia, the aircraft would have continued flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. Then, without power, it would have entered a spiral dive, spinning faster and faster until it hit the ocean at terminal velocity. The impact would have been catastrophic. The aircraft would have shattered into thousands of pieces. The debris field would be small and deep, everything sinking quickly. But if someone was at the controls, if the descent was managed, the scenario changes. A skilled pilot could glide a 777 for significant distances without engine power. They could control the descent rate. They could choose the impact point, and they could attempt a controlled ditching, bringing the aircraft down on the ocean surface as gently as possible. A ditching does not guarantee survival. Water is not soft. At high speed, hitting water is like hitting concrete. But a skilled pilot might keep the aircraft more intact. The wreckage would be larger, easier to find. The debris recovered so far does not definitively answer which scenario occurred. The flaperon showed high impact damage, but not total destruction. Some interior panels were shattered, others were relatively intact. The evidence is contradictory, which means the descent could have been anything from a controlled ditching attempt to a spiralling plunge. Independent researchers confirmed the Inmarsat analysis. Experts like Richard Godfrey, a retired physicist with decades of experience in satellite communications, worked with publicly available data to verify the calculations. He reached the same conclusions. The plane had gone south. Victor Ianello, an engineer specializing in signal analysis, also examined the data independently. He found no errors in Inmarsat's work. The physics worked. The plane had flown into the Indian Ocean, but the ocean is vast, and the models could only narrow the search area to thousands of square kilometres. A margin of error measured in hundreds of miles meant the difference between finding wreckage and finding nothing. Small uncertainties in the aircraft's speed, heading, or altitude could shift the projected crash site significantly. If the plane had been flying slightly faster, it would have gone farther south. Slightly slower, and it would have come down farther north. The search teams were looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack covered an area larger than some countries, and no one was entirely sure which haystack. Critics argued that the Inmarsat data, while sophisticated, was not infallible. The calculations required assumptions. They assumed the aircraft had flown at constant altitude. They assumed no significant course changes after the final turn south. They assumed the engines performed within normal parameters. Any of these assumptions could be wrong. If the aircraft had climbed or descended, if it had turned east or west, if one engine had failed before the other, the calculations would produce incorrect results. Some ocean current experts noted that the debris recovered from beaches did not match the drift patterns expected if the plane had crashed in the official search zone. They built their own computer models, simulating how floating debris would move through the Indian Ocean. They factored in wind, surface currents, seasonal variations, and the specific buoyancy characteristics of aircraft components. The model suggested the wreckage originated farther north and east, closer to Madagascar, not off the coast of Australia. If true, the entire 3-year search had been conducted in the wrong ocean. The ships had dragged their sonar arrays over the wrong sea floor. The underwater vehicles had photographed the wrong underwater mountains, and Flight 370 remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and undiscovered, waiting for someone to look in the right place. In 2018, a private American company called Ocean Infinity launched a new search. They deployed autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sophisticated sonar and mapping technology. Unlike earlier searches that used towed arrays, these drones operated independently. They could descend to extreme depths, navigate complex underwater terrain, and scan the ocean floor faster and more efficiently than any previous effort. Ocean Infinity's contract with the Malaysian government was unusual. They would be paid only if they found the wreckage. No find, no fee. It was a gamble, but the company believed their technology gave them an advantage. They covered thousands of square kilometres in months. They found shipwrecks, some from the age of sail. They mapped geological formations that had never been documented. They discovered underwater landscapes of stunning beauty and complexity, canyons and mountains and plains that had existed unseen since the ocean formed. But they did not find Flight 370. The contract expired. The search ended. The ocean kept its secret. Why we cannot let go. The human brain is not wired to accept uncertainty. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We evolved to see cause and effect, to identify threats, and to make sense of our environment. We see faces in clouds. We find constellations in random arrangements of stars. We construct narratives from disconnected events, because stories are how we understand the world. And when something as large and public as a commercial airliner vanishes, our minds demand an explanation proportional to the event. A mechanical failure feels too mundane. Planes are supposed to be safe. We trust them because they have redundancy, because they are maintained, because accidents are rare and usually explainable. The idea that a simple malfunction could erase 239 people does not match the scale of the tragedy. It feels insufficient. Pilot error feels too simple. Pilots are trained. They are vetted. They go through psychological evaluations and regular check rides. They fly millions of passengers safely every year. The idea that one pilot could deliberately murder hundreds of people clashes with everything we believe about the profession. It makes flying feel dangerous in a way we cannot control. So we want a story that matches the scale of the mystery. We want villains, motives, and hidden agendas. We want someone to blame who is not just a person but an institution, a government, a conspiracy large enough to feel worthy of the loss. Flight 370 offers all of that. The official narrative has gaps large enough to fly a 777 through. Why did the transponder go dark at the exact moment the plane was being handed off between air traffic controllers? The timing was perfect. Too perfect. If someone wanted to disappear a plane, this would be the moment to do it. The gap between controllers, the moment when no one is watching, when responsibility is transferring and everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. Why did the aircraft execute a perfect turn back over Malaysia, threading through radar coverage gaps? The flight path looks deliberate. It looks planned. It follows borders, exploits blind spots, and navigates with precision through some of the most monitored airspace in the world. This is not the wandering track of a doomed aircraft flying on autopilot. This is navigation. Why did no distress call ever come? Pilots are trained to communicate. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Even in emergencies, even when things are falling apart, you try to let someone know what is happening. Flight 370 went silent and stayed silent for 7 hours. That silence is the loudest mystery of all. These are not small questions. They are the foundation of doubt. And when official explanations cannot address them satisfactorily, people stop trusting the narrative. They start looking for alternatives. They start believing that maybe, just maybe, there is more to the story than governments are willing to admit. Governments made it worse. Malaysia withheld radar data for weeks. When they finally released it, the information contradicted earlier statements. They had known from the beginning that the plane had turned back. They had military radar tracks showing the aircraft crossing their country. but they did not share this information with search teams looking in the wrong ocean. Vietnam and Thailand admitted, only later, that their military systems had also tracked the aircraft but did not report it in real time. They saw a plane flying through their airspace without authorization, and they did nothing. No fighter jets scrambled, no alerts issued. The aircraft just flew through, and they watched it go. Australia led a search effort in an area that might have been entirely wrong. They committed ships, personnel, and millions of dollars based on satellite calculations that, while sophisticated, carried significant uncertainty. They found nothing, and then declared the search suspended. They left families with the message that their loved ones were out there somewhere, but not in a place worth continuing to look. China accused Malaysia of incompetence and cover-up. They demanded access to data. They sent their own ships and aircraft to search. They organised family groups and applied diplomatic pressure. But they also controlled the narrative within China, censoring online discussions and managing information flow to prevent panic or political embarrassment. The families of the missing were given conflicting information, false hope, and bureaucratic runarounds. They were told the plane had crashed, then told searchers were still looking for survivors. They were shown debris, then told it might not be from their loved one's aircraft. They were promised transparency, then given redacted reports and classified annexes they could not read. When authorities cannot agree on basic facts, the public stops trusting them. When governments withhold information, people assume the worst. When official explanations do not make sense, alternative theories fill the void. And those theories persist because in some cases they explain the evidence better than the official narrative. History teaches us that institutional deception is not paranoia, it is precedent. Governments have lied about downed airliners before. In 1988, the United States Navy cruiser Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing 290 people. The initial reports claimed the airliner was descending aggressively toward the ship and had been mistaken for a military aircraft. The Vincennes, operating in a combat zone, fired missiles in self-defense. It was a tragic accident, but understandable given the fog of war. Later investigations revealed the truth was more complicated. The airliner was climbing, not descending. It was transmitting civilian identification signals. It was in a recognised commercial air corridor. The crew of the Vincennes had made catastrophic errors in reading their radar systems, in communicating with each other, and in assessing the threat. And the US government had tried to obscure these errors, to present the incident as a reasonable mistake rather than negligence bordering on criminality. In 1983, Soviet fighters shot down Korean Airlines, Flight 007, after it strayed into restricted airspace near Sakhalin Island. 269 people died. The Soviet Union denied responsibility for days. They claimed they had not fired on the aircraft. Then they admitted they had fired but claimed the aircraft had been on a spy mission, deliberately violating Soviet airspace to gather intelligence. They presented radar tracks and radio intercepts that, they argued, proved the aircraft was not a civilian flight. Investigations eventually revealed it was a navigational error. The pilots had programmed the wrong coordinates into their autopilot. The aircraft had drifted hundreds of miles off course. Soviet air defense, operating under Cold War paranoia and assuming the worst, had shot first and investigated later. The truth took years to emerge, and only after political pressure forced both sides to release classified information. These cases prove that civilian airliners can be downed, that governments can lie, and that the truth can be buried under layers of national security and political expediency. When Flight 370 disappeared, these historical echoes shaped public perception. If it happened before, it could happen again. If they lied then, why? Believe them now. The Snowden revelations added fuel. After 2013, the world knew that intelligence agencies conducted mass surveillance, infiltrated communications networks, and operated with minimal oversight. The NSA collected phone records, emails, and internet traffic on a scale that would have seemed impossible before the leaks. They tapped undersea cables, they compromised encryption standards, they monitored foreign leaders, allies, and their own citizens. The idea that a classified program could remotely hijack an aircraft no longer seemed like science fiction. It seemed like Tuesday. If they can read your emails, if they can listen to your phone calls, if they can track your location in real time, why couldn't they take control of a plane? Trust in institutions eroded, and the void filled with suspicion. The ocean remembers, stand on a beach in Madagascar and look east. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beneath miles of water, lies the answer to one of the greatest mysteries of the modern age. It is out there. The fuselage, the cockpit, the black boxes that recorded every word and every system failure in the final moments. It exists in the physical world, corroding slowly in salt water and silt, waiting for someone to find it. But the ocean is patient. It does not care about closure. It does not care about grieving families or public inquiries or conspiracy theories. It holds on to its secrets until it chooses to release them, piece by piece, in its own time. And the Indian Ocean is vast beyond comprehension, covering 70 million square kilometres with depths that reach 7,000 metres in some places. It is a realm where human technology is still primitive. We have better maps of Mars than we do of the ocean floor. The pressure at those depths is crushing. 700 times atmospheric pressure. Enough to collapse submarines not specifically designed to withstand it. Equipment fails. Electronics short out. Materials that seem strong on the surface become brittle and weak. The darkness is absolute. No sunlight penetrates beyond a few hundred meters. Everything below that exists in permanent night, a world where vision is useless and sound is king. The official narrative says Flight 370 ran out of fuel and spiraled into the water in a high-speed dive. The force of impact would have been enormous. Aluminum is strong, but not that strong. The fuselage would have crumpled on impact. Wings would have sheared off. The tail section would have separated. The force of hitting water at terminal velocity would have shattered the aircraft into thousands of fragments. The wreckage would have sunk quickly, tumbling through the water column until it settled on the ocean floor. Over time, currents would carry lighter pieces, the fragments that float, across the Indian Ocean. Seat cushions, insulation, plastic components. These would drift on the surface, carried by wind and waves, until eventually washing ashore on distant beaches. Some would drift for years. Ocean currents move slowly but relentlessly. A piece of debris released near Australia could take 18 months to reach Madagascar. The Indian Ocean gyre circulates clockwise, driven by trade winds and the Coriolis effect. Anything floating would eventually be caught in this current system and transported west, across thousands of kilometres of open ocean, until it reached the African coast or the islands scattered across the western Indian Ocean. But what if the descent was controlled? What if someone in the cockpit guided the plane down, ditching it as gently as physics allowed? A controlled water landing like the famous Hudson River event in 2009 keeps the aircraft more intact. Captain Sullenberger put that Airbus down on the river with such precision that the fuselage remained in one piece. Passengers evacuated onto the wings. Everyone survived. It was a miracle of skill and composure. But Hudson River was different. The river is calm. The aircraft was at low altitude and low speed. The conditions were ideal for ditching. The Indian Ocean is not calm. Waves reach heights that can swallow ships. The surface is constantly moving, rising and falling with swells that can be 12 feet high even on a good day. Touching down on moving water is like landing on a highway, where the pavement is jumping up and down. The timing has to be perfect. One wingtip hits a wave crest while the other is in a trough, and the aircraft cartwheels, disintegrating instantly. If Flight 370 attempted a controlled ditching, the pilot would have needed extraordinary skill and luck. Lower the landing gear to slow down, but not so much that the gear catches and rips off. keep the wings level despite the waves, touch down at the lowest possible speed while maintaining enough control authority to keep the nose up. Even if everything went perfectly, the aircraft would still have taken massive damage. The belly would have ruptured, water would have flooded in within seconds, the plane would sink in minutes. But it would sink slower than a high-speed crash. It would stay more recognisable. If Flight 370 went down that way, the wreckage would be larger, more concentrated, and potentially easier to find. The fuselage might have remained relatively intact, settling onto the ocean floor as a recognisable shape rather than scattered fragments. The black boxes, designed to survive impact and immersion, would still be attached to the tail section. They would still be broadcasting their locator pings, those ultrasonic signals that search equipment can detect from several kilometres away. Except the batteries in those locator beacons only last about 30 days. After that, they go silent. By the time search teams arrived in the right general area, the beacons had stopped transmitting. The wreckage became just another feature of the ocean floor, indistinguishable from rock formations or coral, structures, or the countless other objects resting in the deep. The fragments recovered so far suggest violent structural failure. The flaperon showed damage consistent with high-speed impact. The edges were torn, not cut. The composite materials had shattered rather than bending. Interior panels were shattered. The honeycomb structure collapsed by force. But without the main wreckage, without the black boxes, the evidence is incomplete. We are trying to reconstruct a crime scene with less than 1% of the puzzle pieces. A controlled ditching also means something more disturbing. It means consciousness, decision-making, and intent. It means whoever was at the controls was still there at the end, still flying the plane, still making choices. It means they guided the aircraft to the most remote part of the ocean deliberately, ensuring that even if the wreckage was found, it would take years or decades. It means they wanted the plane to disappear. The families left behind, 239 people boarded Flight 370. They carried passports, phones, wallets, photographs and plans. Some were travelling for business, some were going home, some were starting vacations. They had families who expected to hear from them after landing, parents waiting for calls, children expecting their mum or dad to return, spouses holding on to boarding passes and text messages, the last scraps of communication before silence. Philip Wood was supposed to meet his partner Sarah Bache in Beijing. They had been planning to move in together. He had sent her a message before boarding, something casual, something about seeing her soon. That message became the last record of his voice. Sarah spent years searching for answers, attending press conferences, confronting Malaysian officials, and refusing to accept that he was simply gone without explanation. The families of the Freescale Semiconductor employees faced a different kind of grief. Their loved ones had been travelling as a group, colleagues and friends who worked together daily. The families knew each other. They had attended company picnics and holiday parties. Now they gathered not for celebration but for memorial services. They created support networks, sharing information and theories, trying to find meaning in a tragedy that offered none. The Chinese families who made up the majority of passengers organised themselves into advocacy groups. They held protests outside the Malaysian embassy in Beijing, demanding transparency and accountability. They hired lawyers to sue the airline. They crowdfunded independent investigations. Some believed their loved ones had been murdered, not lost to an accident. They demanded the government treat the disappearance as a criminal case, not a simple crash. When the plane did not arrive, those families entered a kind of purgatory. Their loved ones were not confirmed dead because no bodies were recovered. But they were not alive because the plane had vanished. Grief without closure is a special kind of torment. It does not allow you to move on because there is always the possibility, however small, that the official story is wrong, that somewhere, somehow, the person you lost might still exist. Death is final. Death brings pain, but it also brings certainty. You can mourn. You can bury the body. You can begin the slow process of healing. But when someone disappears, when they simply cease to exist without evidence, The mind cannot close the door. It keeps the possibility alive. Maybe they survived the crash. Maybe they are on an island somewhere. Maybe the plane landed and they are being held captive. These thoughts are irrational, but grief is not rational. The Chinese government organised support groups for the families of Chinese passengers. They held memorials, provided counselling, and pressured Malaysian authorities for answers. But they also controlled the narrative within China. Online discussions about the disappearance were monitored and sometimes censored. Conspiracy theories that blamed the Chinese government or suggested the passengers were still alive were removed. The state wanted grief to be orderly, contained, and directed toward Malaysia, not toward Beijing. Some families accused Malaysia of criminal negligence. The delayed response, the contradictory statements, the withheld radar data all suggested incompetence at best and cover-up at worst. They demanded criminal charges against air traffic controllers, against Malaysian Airlines executives, against anyone who might be held responsible for what they saw as preventable deaths. Others believed their loved ones had been murdered, not lost to an accident. They demanded investigations, transparency, and accountability. What they received were press conferences, reports, and platitudes. Officials spoke in carefully rehearsed sentences. They expressed sympathy. They promised continued efforts. But they offered no answers, no bodies, and no justice. Conspiracy theories, for the families, were not abstract intellectual exercises. They were lifelines. If the plane had been taken, their loved ones might still be alive. If there was a cover-up, there might be justice. The alternative, that random catastrophe had simply erased the people they loved, offered nothing to hold on to, and so they clung to possibilities, no matter how unlikely, because the human heart needs hope, even when hope is irrational. 10 years later, some families still search. They organise independent investigations. They crowdfund search efforts. They analyse ocean currents and drift models. They correspond with retired aviation experts and amateur researchers. They refuse to accept that the answer is we do not know and never will. Because for them, the missing are not a cold case. They are parents, children, friends, and partners who deserve to be found. Grace Nathan lost her mother on Flight 370. She has spent the decade since becoming an advocate for families of the missing. She attends conferences. She speaks to journalists. She pressures governments to continue searching. She has become an expert in satellite analysis, ocean current modelling, and aviation investigation procedures. She did not choose this expertise. It was forced upon her by the refusal of authorities to provide answers. She learned because no one else would do it for her. There are dozens like her. Family members who transformed grief into action, who refused to be placated by official statements, who learned the technical details of aircraft systems and search methodologies because they needed to understand what happened. They are amateur investigators driven by love and loss. And they will not stop searching because stopping means accepting that their loved ones are gone forever, without explanation. The final accounting. On March 8th, 2014, at 12:41 in the morning, a Boeing 777 departed Kuala Lumpur for Beijing. At 8:11 that morning, it sent its last signal to a satellite. In the hours between, someone or something redirected the aircraft, disabled its communication systems, and flew it into one of the most remote parts of the planet. The official investigation concluded that manual intervention was responsible, but could not identify who or why. The search for wreckage became the most expensive in aviation history and found almost nothing. The families of the missing were left without answers, without bodies, and without closure. The conspiracy theories emerged because the gaps in the official story were too large to ignore. Every alternative explanation, from pilot suicide to remote hijacking to military interception, attempted to impose logic on the void. Some theories were plausible, others were absurd, but all of them shared a common origin: the refusal to accept that the world's most advanced aviation infrastructure could lose an aircraft and never recover it. What we know is this. Flight 3. 70 flew for nearly 7 hours after disappearing from civilian radar. It crossed Malaysia, turned northwest, then south. It flew over open ocean until fuel exhaustion. Debris confirmed to be from the aircraft washed ashore across the western Indian Ocean. The satellite data proves the plane went south. The fragments prove it crashed. The plane is gone. The people are gone. The answers are still out there, somewhere beneath the waves, waiting. What we do not know is why. We do not know who made the decision to turn the plane around. We do not know if it was one person or many. We do not know if it was planned or impulsive, political or personal, malicious or desperate. We do not know if the passengers died quickly from hypoxia or spent hours terrified in the dark. We do not know if the cockpit was locked, if there was a struggle, if anyone tried to stop what was happening. We do not know because the ocean does not give up its secrets easily. The search officially ended in January of 2017. The case remains open. The families still grieve. The wreckage still lies somewhere in the dark, untouched and undiscovered. And the theories persist because mysteries this profound do not die. They evolve, adapt, and take on new life with each unanswered question. Flight 3. 70 vanished, but its ghost remains. In the forums where researchers argue over satellite data. In the dreams of families who lost someone that night. In the warnings issued by aviation authorities who now know that a plane can simply disappear, and the world may never find it. The ocean holds the truth, and it is not ready to let go. Some mysteries are solved with evidence and investigation. Others are solved only with time, when the ocean finally erodes the wreckage enough for it to surface, or when someone stumbles across the debris field by accident. And some mysteries are never solved at all. They remain open wounds in the historical record, questions without answers, tragedies without closure. Flight 3. 70 is all of those things. It is a disappearance that defies explanation. A disaster that left no wreckage in the place anyone expected to find it. A crime scene with no crime that can be proven. A ghost story written in satellite data and ocean currents. And it remains, 10 years later, the plane that the world could not find and cannot forget. The sea knows what happened. The sea watched it fall. But the sea does not speak, and we are left with silence, fragments, and the terrible knowledge that 239 people left the ground and never returned. The only certainty is this. Somewhere beneath the Indian Ocean, in water too deep and too dark for light to reach, the answer still waits. It has been waiting for 10 years. It will wait for as many more as it takes. Because the ocean is patient, and the truth, however buried, does not cease to exist. It simply remains unfound.